The persistent creak of leather accompanied each step as Hank Miller made his way across the weathered porch of his ranch house. Dawn had barely broken over the eastern ridgeline of the Absaroka Range, painting the Wyoming sky in washes of amber and gold. At 62, Hank's movements carried the deliberate quality of a man who had spent decades rising before the sun. His body, lean and sinewy from a lifetime of physical labor, moved with purpose despite the protests of aging joints. The coffee in his mug steamed in the crisp morning air as he surveyed his property. 300 acres of rugged terrain that had been in the Miller family for 3 generations. The land spread out before him, a patchwork of grazing pastures hemmed in by pine forest and rising into the foothills that eventually gave way to the mountains themselves. The Miller Ranch sat approximately 15 miles southeast of Cody, Wyoming, positioned where the flat grasslands began their gradual ascent toward the wilderness. It was prime cattle country, though maintaining it required constant vigilance against the elements and the wildlife that periodically ventured down from the mountains. Hank had grown accustomed to the rhythm of ranch life, the seasonal cycles of calving, branding, and moving the herd, the endless mending of fences, and the careful management of grazing rotations. There was comfort in the predictability, even as every day presented its own unique challenges. Hank sipped his coffee, grimacing slightly at its bitterness. Sarah, his wife of 38 years, had always made it better, but since her passing 3 years prior, he'd never quite mastered her technique. Their son Michael lived in Billings with his wife and kids, making the 2-hour drive down every few weeks to help with the more demanding tasks. Their daughter Elizabeth had settled in Denver, her corporate job in environmental engineering, keeping her tethered to the city despite her love for the ranch. Hank didn't blame either of them for choosing different paths. Ranch life was demanding, offering limited financial rewards compared to the stability of urban employment. Still, the land was his legacy, and he intended to maintain it until he was physically unable to do so. The morning air carried the particular crispness of early October. Fall had firmly established itself across the landscape, with aspens spotting the distant hillsides in bursts of gold. The nights had grown colder, frost occasionally glazing the grass in the early hours, though the days still offered comfortable working temperatures. Hank drained the last of his coffee and returned inside to prepare for the day ahead. The kitchen, with its dated appliances and worn linoleum floor, had remained largely unchanged since the 1990s. There was little reason to modernize when everything still functioned adequately. Efficiency and practicality governed Hank's decisions, both in ranching and in life generally. After a breakfast of eggs and toast, Hank gathered his tools for the day's primary task. The northeast perimeter fence had been showing signs of weakness during his inspection the previous afternoon. Several posts had loosened in the soil, likely from the combined effects of recent rainfall and pressure from the cattle seeking grazing opportunities on the other side. If left unaddressed, the fence would eventually fail completely, leading to the potential loss of livestock or worse, injury to his animals from barbed wire. Prevention was always preferable to remedy in ranch management. Hank loaded his pickup, truck with fence posts, wire, a post hole digger, hammer, pliers, wire cutters, and a large adjustable wrench, his standard fence repair kit. The blue 2008 Ford F-150 had logged over 230,000 miles, but remained reliable through consistent maintenance. He added 2 full water bottles, his lunch packed in a small cooler, and a first aid kit as standard precautions for working alone in remote areas of the property. As an afterthought, he grabbed a flannel jacket from the hook by the door. The forecast called for clear skies, but the temperature could drop quickly if clouds moved in over the mountains. The drive to the northeast section took nearly 20 minutes, following dirt roads that wound through the property, occasionally requiring Hank to stop and open gates between paddocks. He drove with the window down, the radio tuned to a local station playing classic country. The scent of pine and sage filtered through the cab, carried on a gentle breeze. The land showed the effects of the drier-than-average summer. The grass was shorter than ideal, and some areas appeared more brown than green. They'd need substantial snowfall over the winter to replenish the soil moisture for next year's growth. Hank's cattle, predominantly Black Angus with some Hereford crossbreeds, grazed in the distance, dark shapes scattered across the landscape. He counted approximately 30 head in view, with the remainder of his 80-animal herd likely grazing in the adjacent western pasture. They appeared healthy despite the challenging grazing conditions, a testament to his careful management of the herd's rotation between pastures to prevent overgrazing. The fence line came into view as Hank rounded a small rise. It stretched in both directions, marking the boundary between his property and public land that eventually transitioned into national forest. This proximity to wilderness areas was both a blessing and a challenge. The views were spectacular, and the land retained a wild quality that Hank deeply appreciated, but it also meant occasional encounters with wildlife that descended from the mountains: deer, elk, the occasional moose, and more rarely, predators like wolves, mountain lions, and bears. Parking his truck alongside the fence, Hank surveyed the damage. Approximately 50 yards of fencing showed signs of weakness, with 3 posts visibly leaning and sections of wire sagging between them. The cause became apparent upon closer inspection. Recent rains had eroded soil around the base of the posts, and it appeared that elk had pushed against the fence while crossing the area, further destabilizing the structure. It was typical seasonal damage, nothing extraordinary but requiring prompt attention nonetheless. Hank began by unloading his supplies, organizing them for efficient access as he worked. Experience had taught him that proper preparation saved considerable time and energy. The morning was still cool, the sun gradually climbing higher but not yet delivering its full warming potential. Hank selected a section to begin with and set to work removing the compromised fence post, using the post hole digger to widen the hole before extracting the weathered wood. Time seemed to compress when he worked. The physical rhythm of digging, lifting, hammering, and securing wire created a meditative state where hours passed without conscious awareness. By mid-morning, Hank had replaced 2 posts and restrung the connecting wire sections. Sweat dampened his shirt despite the cool air, and he paused to drink from one of his water bottles, surveying his progress with satisfaction. It was during this brief rest that he first noticed something unusual. A cluster of magpies took flight from a copse of trees approximately 200 yards away, their harsh calls carrying across the open ground. Birds often scattered when disturbed by passing wildlife, but something about their sudden flight pattern suggested a larger creature's presence. Hank squinted against the sunlight, scanning the area methodically. The tree line where the fence approached the forest created areas of shadow where visibility was limited. After several moments of observation revealed nothing unusual, Hank returned to his work, though a vague sense of watchfulness remained with him. Wildlife encounters were common enough that they rarely caused concern. In his decades on the ranch, he had crossed paths with nearly every species native to the region. These interactions typically resulted in the animals retreating, as most preferred to avoid human contact. Even predators like mountain lions generally gave humans a wide berth. Bears, however, were a different matter. Both black bears and grizzlies inhabited the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, with their ranges extending well beyond the national park boundaries. Over the years, Hank had spotted bears on his property perhaps a dozen times, mostly from a safe distance. The majority had been black bears, which, while potentially dangerous, were generally less aggressive than their larger cousins. Grizzlies were rarer sightings, their population smaller, and their territories typically higher in the mountains. Nevertheless, their presence in the region was an established fact, and encounters, while uncommon, did occur. The Wyoming Game and Fish Department regularly updated landowners on bear activity in the area, issuing warnings during periods of increased sightings or when bears exhibited unusual behavior. The most recent advisory, issued 2 weeks prior, had mentioned increased grizzly movement as the bears intensified their foraging before winter hibernation. During this hyperphagia period, bears could consume up to 20,000 calories daily, making them more active and potentially more likely to explore areas closer to human habitation in search of food sources. Hank continued his work with these considerations lingering in the back of his mind. The third post proved more challenging than the previous 2, its bottom end having rotted in the damp soil, making extraction difficult. He worked the post back and forth, gradually loosening its grip in the earth. The exertion caused his breath to come in short bursts, and he paused to wipe sweat from his brow with his sleeve. It was in this moment of concentration that Hank failed to notice the subtle changes in the environment around him. The usual background chorus of birdsong had diminished, replaced by an unnatural quiet that might have alerted him had he been less focused on the task at hand. The wind shifted slightly, carrying new scents across the open ground, among them one that would have immediately raised alarm had he detected it, the musky odor of a large predator. The fence post finally gave way, and Hank pulled it free from the ground with a grunt of satisfaction. Setting it aside, he reached for one of the new posts leaning against his truck. As he turned back toward the fence line, movement at the edge of his peripheral vision finally caught his attention. A large form had emerged from the tree line approximately 70 yards away and was moving deliberately across the open ground, directly toward him. Hank's body tensed instinctively before his conscious mind fully processed what he was seeing. The animal's size alone was sufficient to identify it as a grizzly bear, its massive shoulder hump, distinctive even at this distance. Its fur appeared dark brown, almost black in places, with the characteristic silver-tipped hairs that gave grizzlies their silver-tip nickname, catching the sunlight as it moved. Hank estimated its weight at over 600 pounds, marking it as a mature adult. Time seemed to slow as Hank assessed his situation with the clarity that accompanies moments of extreme danger. His truck sat approximately 15 feet away, keys in the ignition. The bear, while moving steadily, wasn't yet charging. Running would likely trigger a predatory response, as bears can reach speeds of 35 mph over short distances, far faster than any human. Making himself appear larger while backing slowly toward the vehicle seemed the most prudent course of action. "Hey, bear!" Hank called out loudly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his system. Bear safety protocols recommended speaking in firm tones to alert the animal to human presence, as bears occasionally approached humans out of curiosity rather than aggression when they failed to identify them from a distance. The grizzly paused at the sound, its massive head swinging toward Hank, its small dark eyes fixed on him with an intensity that sent a chill through his body despite the morning warmth. The bear rose briefly onto its hind legs, not as a prelude to attack, but as many bears do to improve their scent detection and vision. Standing upright, it would have measured over 7 feet tall, its size all the more imposing from Hank's vulnerable position. Dropping back to all fours, the bear continued its approach, though now with more apparent purpose. It covered ground, with surprising speed considering its bulk, its gait revealing the power contained in its muscular limbs. Hank continued backing toward his truck, maintaining eye contact while speaking firmly. "Back off now, go on, get out of here." The bear's behavior didn't fit the pattern of a predatory approach. There was no stalking, no attempt at concealment. Rather, it moved with the confidence of an apex predator in its territory, perhaps investigating this human intrusion out of curiosity or territorial defense. As it closed the distance to approximately 40 yards, Hank noticed details that sent another surge of adrenaline through his system, a fresh scar across the bear's muzzle, and an unusual agitation in its movement, suggesting potential previous conflict with humans or other bears. Hank reached his truck and carefully opened the door without turning his back to the animal. The bear increased its pace, crossing the remaining distance with alarming speed. As Hank attempted to climb into the cab, his boot slipped on the metal step, throwing him off balance. In the crucial seconds this error cost him, the grizzly closed the final gap. The bear's first swipe caught Hank across his left shoulder, the impact spinning him away from the truck door and throwing him to the ground. Pain exploded across his back as claws tore through his shirt and into flesh. Training and instinct took over. Hank curled into a fetal position, protecting his vital organs while covering his neck and head with his arms. The standard advice for surviving a grizzly attack when escape is impossible: play dead, minimize damage, and wait for the bear to lose interest. The grizzly circled him, huffing and popping its jaws, signs of extreme agitation. It prodded at Hank's body with its muzzle, the hot breath washing over him carrying the scent of recent kills. Every muscle in Hank's body screamed with the urge to flee, but he maintained the protective position, knowing that movement now would likely intensify the attack. When the bear bit down on his right calf, the pain was indescribable. A crushing pressure followed by the sharp sensation of teeth penetrating muscle. Hank couldn't prevent the cry that escaped his lips, a primal sound that echoed across the open pasture. The bear reacted to his vocalization by redoubling its attack, dragging him several feet across the ground before releasing its grip. In the momentary reprieve, Hank's hand closed around something solid, the large adjustable wrench that had fallen from his tool belt during the initial impact. The presence of the tool sparked a desperate calculation in his mind. Playing dead clearly wasn't deterring this particular bear, whose behavior suggested unusual aggression. With no other options remaining, Hank made a decision that contradicted standard bear encounter protocols, but seemed his only chance for survival. As the grizzly approached again, Hank tightened his grip on the wrench. When the massive head came within range, he struck out with all his remaining strength, connecting solidly with the bear's sensitive nose. The impact produced a hollow thud, followed by an enraged roar. Blood sprayed from the bear's nostrils, some of it spattering across Hank's face and chest. The counterattack further enraged the already aggressive animal. It reared up, paws extended, before dropping its full weight onto Hank's body. The impact drove the air from his lungs, and he felt ribs crack under the tremendous pressure. The bear's jaws snapped inches from his face as he desperately swung the wrench again, this time striking the side of the animal's head with enough force that the metal tool bent slightly. The grizzly shook its head, momentarily disoriented by the blow. In this critical moment, Hank summoned his remaining strength and struck a third time, connecting with the bear's right eye. The animal recoiled, backing away several steps while shaking its massive head. Blood matted the fur around its eye and muzzle, and its vocalizations changed from aggressive roars to pained huffs. Hank remained motionless, the wrench still clutched in his bloodied hand, ready for the bear's return, but the animal seemed to have lost its aggressive focus. It circled at a distance of about 15 feet, occasionally pawing at its injured eye. After what seemed an eternity, but was likely less than a minute, the grizzly turned and lumbered back toward the tree line, occasionally glancing back as if to ensure it wasn't being pursued. Only when the bear had disappeared into the forest did Hank allow himself to assess his injuries. His breathing came in short, painful gasps, suggesting broken ribs. His left shoulder and back burned where the bear's claws had torn through muscle. His right calf throbbed relentlessly where teeth had pierced flesh and crushed tissue. Warm wetness around his left ear suggested another injury he hadn't even registered during the attack. Part of his ear had been torn away in the struggle. The adrenaline that had sustained him began to ebb, replaced by waves of pain washing through his body. Shock threatened to overwhelm him, but decades of self-reliance on the ranch had instilled a resilience that served him now. Hank knew that his survival depended on reaching help before blood loss or exposure compounded his injuries. With excruciating effort, he dragged himself toward his truck, each movement sending fresh agony through his damaged body. The distance of 15 feet might as well have been miles as he inched across the ground, leaving a trail of blood on the dry earth. After what seemed an interminable struggle, he reached the vehicle and used the door handle to pull himself upright. The simple act of climbing into the driver's seat nearly caused him to lose consciousness as damaged ribs shifted and torn muscles stretched. Once seated, he took several moments to steady his breathing and focus his thoughts. The keys remained in the ignition, a habit from years of working in isolated areas where vehicle theft was virtually non-existent. This small mercy might well have saved his life. Starting the engine, Hank fumbled for his cell phone in his pocket. The screen was cracked from the impact of the fall, but it still functioned. Reception in this remote area was unpredictable at best, and today offered only a single bar of service, enough perhaps for a text message but unlikely to maintain a call. He typed a brief message to Michael. Bearatakni fence, heading to town, bad hurt. He pressed send and watched the progress indicator slowly advance until confirmation appeared. The drive back to the main house presented a new set of challenges. Each bump in the rough dirt road sent spikes of pain through Hank's body. Blood soaked the truck's seat, and his vision occasionally blurred, signs of progressive blood loss that he recognized from past injuries, though none as severe as these. He focused on the immediate task, navigating gates and turns with mechanical precision, born from decades of traversing the same routes. Upon reaching the main house, Hank faced a critical decision. The nearest hospital was in Cody, approximately 15 miles away. In his current condition, continuing to drive presented significant risks. Potential loss of consciousness while behind the wheel, chief among them. Yet waiting for emergency services to reach this remote location would consume precious time. Hank chose to continue driving, reasoning that he would encounter other vehicles and potential assistance as he approached town. He paused only long enough to awkwardly wrap his torn calf with a towel from behind the seat, creating a makeshift pressure bandage to slow the bleeding. His ear and back continued to seep blood, but addressing those injuries would require more dexterity than he could currently manage. The ranch's driveway connected to County Road 7, a rural route that saw limited traffic, particularly during weekday mornings. Hank turned toward Cody, maintaining a steady speed despite the urgency of his situation. Safety remained paramount. Reaching help would be impossible if he crashed due to excessive speed on the winding road. 10 minutes into the drive, Hank spotted an approaching vehicle, a Wyoming Department of Transportation truck heading in the opposite direction. He flashed his lights repeatedly and pulled to the shoulder, honking his horn as the truck approached. The Y-Dot workers, initially confused by the signals, pulled alongside Hank's vehicle. Their expressions shifted rapidly from curiosity to alarm as they observed his blood-soaked clothing and obvious distress. "Grizzly attack," Hank managed through gritted teeth. "Need hospital." The Y-Dot employees responded with efficient professionalism. One immediately radioed for emergency services, while the other, identifying himself as having wilderness first aid training, helped stabilize Hank's position to prevent further injury during the wait. Within 15 minutes, an ambulance from Cody arrived, its lights flashing against the backdrop of the Absaroka Mountains. The paramedics worked quickly, assessing Hank's injuries while establishing IV access to begin fluid replacement. Their practiced movements reflected the specialized training required for rural emergency medicine in areas where wildlife encounters occasionally resulted in severe trauma. They applied proper pressure dressings to his wounds, administered pain medication, and carefully transferred him to a backboard before loading him into the ambulance. The journey to Cody Regional Health took approximately 20 minutes, during which the paramedics maintained constant communication with the emergency department. One paramedic, a woman in her 30s named Jessica, kept up a steady stream of questions, both to assess Hank's mental status and to keep him engaged and conscious. "Can you tell me what happened, sir?" she asked while checking his blood pressure for the second time. Hank recounted the encounter in terse sentences, his voice occasionally faltering as pain broke through the medication's effects or when the ambulance hit rougher sections of road. Jessica nodded as she listened, her expression revealing both professional concern and the personal impact of his story. "You fought off a grizzly with a wrench?" she asked, a note of impressed disbelief in her voice. "Didn't have much choice," Hank replied, his words slightly slurred from the pain medication. "Bear wasn't following the rules about playing dead." Jessica smiled at this moment of grim humor. "Sometimes they don't read the safety manuals. You're lucky to be alive, Mr. Miller. Not many people can tell stories about surviving a grizzly encounter at close range. Don't feel particularly lucky right now," Hank muttered, wincing as the ambulance turned into the hospital drive. The emergency department had prepared for his arrival based on the paramedics' communications. A trauma team was waiting as the ambulance doors opened, and Hank was quickly transferred to a treatment room where multiple medical professionals began working simultaneously. A physician introduced himself as Dr. Reeves while cutting away what remained of Hank's blood-soaked clothing to fully assess his injuries. "Mr. Miller, I'm going to give you a rundown of what we're seeing and what we're going to do," Dr. Reeves explained while examining the claw marks across Hank's back. "You have multiple lacerations, including a partial avulsion of your left ear. The bite wound on your right calf is our primary concern due to the crushing component and potential for infection. You also have what appear to be at least 3 fractured ribs on your left side. We're going to need to take you to surgery to properly clean and repair these wounds." Hank nodded, the clinical description of his injuries somehow less overwhelming than the experience of receiving them. A nurse was already drawing blood samples for analysis, while another established a second IV line. The organized chaos of the trauma room created a strange sense of detachment. Hank found himself observing the activity as if from a distance, a common psychological response to severe trauma that the medical team recognized and monitored. "We'll need to administer antibiotics immediately," Dr. Reeves continued. "Bear attacks carry a high risk of infection due to the bacteria present in their mouths and claws. We'll also need to report this incident to Game and Fish. Is there anyone you'd like us to contact for you?" "My son," Hank replied. "Michael Miller. Numbers in my phone, already texted him about the attack." As the medical team prepared him for surgery, a sheriff's deputy arrived to take an initial report. The deputy, a man named Craig Wilson, whom Hank recognized from community events, approached with a notebook in hand. "Mr. Miller, I hate to bother you right now, "But I need to get some basic information about the attack while it's fresh," Deputy Wilson explained. "Game and Fish will want to follow up later with more details." Hank provided a concise account of the encounter: location, approximate time, the bear's description, and his defensive actions. The deputy noted the information efficiently, his expression growing more concerned as Hank described the bear's unusually aggressive behavior. "Sounds like it might have been food-conditioned or had previous human encounters," the deputy observed. "The scar you mentioned could indicate it's been in conflicts before. I'll pass this along to the wildlife management team. They'll likely want to investigate the site and attempt to identify this particular bear." As the conversation concluded, an anesthesiologist arrived to prepare Hank for surgery. The medical team continued their preparations, connecting monitoring equipment and discussing surgical approach. Before the anesthesia took effect, Hank's thoughts turned to the bear, where it might be now, whether it would encounter someone else, whether its unusual aggression would lead wildlife officials to determine it was a problem animal requiring removal. These considerations faded as the medication entered his system, replacing conscious thought with dreamless chemical sleep. The surgery lasted nearly 4 hours as the medical team meticulously cleaned and repaired Hank's numerous injuries. The calf wound required extensive debridement of damaged tissue and repair of muscle structures, compromised by the crushing force of the bear's jaws. His ear required plastic surgery techniques to salvage the remaining tissue and minimize deformity. The lacerations across his back needed dozens of sutures placed in multiple layers to properly close. Throughout the procedure, the surgical team irrigated the wounds thoroughly with antimicrobial solutions to reduce the significant infection risk associated with bear attacks. When Hank regained consciousness in the recovery room, the first sensation that registered was pain, duller than before surgery, but persistent despite the medication in his system. The second was the presence of someone beside his bed. Through blurred vision, he recognized his son Michael's concerned face watching him closely. "Dad?" Michael leaned forward as he noticed Hank's eyes opening. "Can you hear me?" Hank attempted to respond, but his throat felt raw from the breathing tube used during surgery. He managed a slight nod instead, which was enough to bring visible relief to his son's expression. "You scared the hell out of me," Michael said, his voice uncharacteristically emotional. At 35, he had inherited Hank's stoic demeanor, typically maintaining careful control over displays of feeling. "Your text came through garbled. All I could make out was bear and hurt. I drove down as soon as I got it." A nurse entered the recovery room, efficiently checking Hank's vital signs and pain levels before administering additional medication through his IV. She explained that Dr. Reeves would visit shortly to discuss the surgical outcomes and recovery expectations. "Your dad's tough," she commented to Michael with professional admiration. "Dr. Reeves said most people with these injuries would be in much worse shape." "He's too stubborn to let a bear get the better of him," Michael replied, attempting humor, though the strain remained evident in his voice. When Dr. Reeves arrived 30 minutes later, Hank had regained enough awareness to participate in the conversation about his condition. The surgeon provided a detailed accounting of the injuries and their treatment, using matter-of-fact language that Hank appreciated. "The bite wound on your calf was our biggest concern," Dr. Reeves explained. "Bear bites can cause significant tissue destruction beyond what's immediately visible, and the bacterial load is substantial. We've removed all compromised tissue and repaired the muscle damage, but you'll need ongoing wound care and likely physical therapy to regain full function. Your ear required partial reconstruction. We salvaged what we could, but there will be noticeable deformation. The lacerations on your back were deep but relatively clean. We've placed multiple layers of sutures to minimize scarring, though some will be inevitable." Hank absorbed this information with a nod. Scars were nothing new to someone who had spent a lifetime in physical labor. Function mattered more than appearance at his age. "When can I go home?" he asked, his voice hoarse but determined. Dr. Reeves smiled slightly, having clearly anticipated this question. "Not for at least 3 days, Mr. Miller. We need to monitor you for infection, manage your pain, and ensure the wounds are healing properly before discharge. Even then, you'll need assistance. At home for several weeks. This isn't something you can power through on your own." Michael stepped in before his father could protest. "He'll stay with my family in Billings after discharge. We have a ground-floor guest room, and my wife's a nurse. We've already discussed it." Hank frowned at this arrangement being made without his input, but physical reality tempered his objections. The extent of his injuries made independent living temporarily impossible, particularly in the isolated setting of the ranch. "The ranch," he began, but Michael cut him off. "I've already called Rodriguez. He'll check on the cattle daily and handle the essential maintenance until you're back on your feet." Eduardo Rodriguez was a neighboring rancher who occasionally helped during busy periods. He and Hank had a long-standing arrangement of mutual assistance that had proven valuable numerous times over the years. Knowing the property would be monitored provided some relief, though Hank couldn't entirely suppress his discomfort at relinquishing control of daily operations. As evening approached, additional visitors arrived. Sheriff Tom Lancaster came to take a more detailed statement regarding the attack, bringing with him a wildlife biologist from the Wyoming Game and Fish Department named Diane Mercer. They waited patiently as Hank recounted the encounter in greater detail than he had managed immediately following the attack, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the bear's behavior and physical characteristics. "Based on your description, this sounds like a bear we've been tracking," Mercer said after Hank finished his account. "Male grizzly, approximately 7 to 8 years old, with a distinctive facial scar from a likely territorial dispute with another male. He's been ranging farther from the mountains than usual this season, probably due to the poor berry production following the dry summer." "Is he considered a problem bear?" Michael asked, the protective concern evident in his tone. Mercer's expression became carefully neutral. "We don't typically classify bears as problem animals based on a single incident, particularly when the encounter occurs in what would be considered the bear's natural habitat. Your father's property borders public land that serves as established bear territory. While this attack was unfortunate and severe, it doesn't necessarily indicate predatory behavior targeted at humans." Sheriff Lancaster seemed less convinced by this assessment. "This is the third bear incident in the county this year, Diane. People are getting concerned, and we take those concerns seriously," Mercer replied with the practiced patience of someone accustomed to navigating the tensions between wildlife conservation and human safety. "We'll investigate the site tomorrow, try to gather DNA samples to confirm this bear's identity, and monitor the area for continued activity. But I want to be clear. This occurred in an area where grizzly activity is documented and expected. The bear population is a protected resource that we manage according to established protocols." Hank, listening to this exchange from his hospital bed, recognized the familiar debate between agricultural interests and conservation efforts. As a rancher, he had occasionally found himself frustrated by wildlife policies that seemed to prioritize predator protection over livestock safety. Yet he also valued the wildness of the land he called home, and understood that sharing the landscape with its native species came with inherent risks. "I'm not asking you to hunt it down," Hank interjected, drawing the attention of both officials. "Bear was being a bear. I was in its territory and it responded accordingly. Made some poor decisions on my part during the encounter." Mercer's expression softened slightly. "That's a remarkably balanced view, Mr. Miller, especially considering your current condition. Most people in your situation would be demanding immediate removal of the animal. Wouldn't solve anything," Hank replied with a grimace as he shifted position, triggering a fresh wave of pain. "Another one would just move into the territory. Rather know there's a specific bear out there to be cautious about than have a false sense of security." The conversation concluded shortly thereafter, with promises from both officials to keep Hank informed about their findings and any actions taken. As they departed, the hospital room grew quiet, save for the steady beeping of monitoring equipment. The pain medication had begun to take stronger effect, making Hank's thoughts increasingly disconnected. "You should head back to Billings," he told Michael, noting the exhaustion evident in his son's posture. "Long drive ahead of you." "I've got a room at the Holiday Inn," Michael replied. "Called work and took emergency family leave for the next week. I'm not going anywhere, Dad." Hank wanted to protest, but found his energy failing. The events of the day, from the routine fence repair to the life-threatening attack to the surgical intervention, had depleted his reserves beyond what even his considerable willpower could overcome. As darkness fell outside the hospital windows, he surrendered to medicated sleep, his last conscious thoughts dwelling on the bear that had forever altered his understanding of vulnerability. The following morning brought heightened pain as some of the surgical anesthesia's residual effects wore off, but also increased clarity. A new nurse adjusted Hank's medication dosage and helped him consume a light breakfast, the first food he'd eaten since the previous morning's pre-attack meal. Michael arrived early, having already spoken with Dr. Reeves about the treatment plan moving forward. "Game and fish people are at the ranch right now," Michael informed him. "Rodriguez let them in. They're investigating the attack site and setting up trail cameras to monitor for the bear's return." Hank nodded, finding even this small movement uncomfortable with the bandages covering his partially reconstructed ear. "Doubt it'll come back. Plenty of territory to cover without returning to a spot where it got injured." "That's what the biologist said too, but they're being thorough." Michael hesitated before continuing. "Local news caught wind of the attack. Reporter called my cell this morning asking for details. I didn't say much, but it'll probably make the Cody paper at minimum." This information annoyed Hank more than it perhaps should have. Privacy had always been important to him, and the thought of his misfortune becoming public knowledge, potentially sensationalized into a man versus beast narrative, held little appeal. However, bear attacks in the region were newsworthy by their nature, particularly when the victim survived to tell the tale. "Tell them I've got no comment," Hank said firmly. "Don't need people showing up at the ranch looking for the bear man or whatever nonsense they'll call me." "Already done," Michael assured him, though the nurse mentioned you might want to consider speaking with the paper, just to get accurate information out there. Said sometimes when victims don't provide details, the reports get exaggerated and cause unnecessary panic in the community. This perspective hadn't occurred to Hank, and he grudgingly acknowledged its merit. Sensationalized reporting could lead to unwarranted fear and potentially harmful responses toward bears in general. The grizzly population in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem had recovered significantly from its endangered status, but remained vulnerable to human conflicts and habitat pressures. "I'll think about it," he conceded, though without enthusiasm. The day progressed slowly within the confines of the hospital room. Various medical personnel came and went, checking vital signs, changing dressings, and administering medications. The wound care was particularly uncomfortable, as the cleaning process for the bite wound required thorough irrigation that sent fresh waves of pain through Hank's leg, despite the preemptive pain medication. In the afternoon, Diane Mercer from Game and Fish returned, this time without the sheriff. She carried a tablet containing photographs from the attack site and seemed eager to share her findings. "We found abundant evidence confirming your account," she explained, showing Hank images of blood-stained ground near his truck, paw prints in softer soil areas, and tufts of grizzly fur caught on the barbed wire fence nearby. "Based on the paw size and the hair samples, we're confident this is the bear we suspected, a male designated GB217 in our monitoring program. We've been tracking him since he was a 2-year-old cub." Hank studied the photographs with detached interest, the clinical documentation of the attack site seeming strangely disconnected from his visceral experience of the event. "Any sign of him in the area today?" "No recent activity that we could detect. We've set up cameras and will maintain monitoring for the next few weeks. We've also issued a temporary advisory for the area, recommending heightened precautions for anyone working or recreating in that vicinity." She paused before adding, "I wanted to thank you again for your perspective on this incident. Many people in your position would be advocating for aggressive management actions." Hank shrugged, immediately regretting the movement as pain flared across his sutured back. "Been around long enough to know you can't remove all the risks from life, especially out here. Bear was doing what bears do. I made mistakes in how I handled the situation." Mercer seemed about to respond when her phone buzzed with an incoming message. After checking the screen, her expression tightened subtly. "I need to take care of something. Thank you for your time, Mr. Miller. We'll keep you updated on any significant developments regarding GB217. After her departure, the hospital room returned to its routine of medical checks and quiet intervals, where Hank alternated between sleep and restless wakefulness. The painkillers created a disconnected mental state, where time seemed to compress and expand unpredictably, memories of the attack intruding into his consciousness with vivid clarity before dissolving into medicated haze. By evening, Michael had arranged details for Hank's eventual transfer to Billings for continued recovery. The plan called for him to remain in Cody Regional Health for 2 more days before being discharged to Michael's care, assuming no complications developed. A hospital bed would be delivered to Michael's home, along with necessary medical supplies for ongoing wound management. Elizabeth called, Michael mentioned as he helped adjust Hank's positioning to reduce pressure on his injuries. She wanted to fly in from Denver, but I told her to wait until you're settled in Billings. No sense in her sitting around the hospital when there's nothing she can do right now. Hank nodded in agreement. His daughter's professional responsibilities wouldn't easily accommodate an extended absence, and her presence, while emotionally supportive, wouldn't alter his medical situation. Good call. Tell her I'm fine and not to worry. Michael's expression suggested he had already attempted this approach without success. She's your daughter, Dad. Telling her not to worry is like telling water not to be wet. This drew a small smile from Hank, quickly replaced by a grimace as the movement pulled at his facial lacerations. Elizabeth had always been the more openly emotional of his children, her concern manifesting in concrete actions and persistent inquiry, rather than Michael's quieter, more practical support. Both approaches had their value, and Hank appreciated each for different reasons. The local television news that evening included a brief segment on the attack, featuring generic footage of grizzly bears and an interview with Diane Mercer providing safety recommendations for those living and working in bear country. Hank's name was mentioned, along with a general description of his injuries described as serious but not life-threatening. The report emphasized that the incident had occurred in known bear habitat and cautioned against overreaction. Could be worse, Hank commented as the segment concluded. At least they're not calling for a bear hunt or portraying me as some kind of wilderness hero. Give it time, Michael replied dryly. Local paper might have a different take. Cody Enterprise has always leaned more toward the man conquers nature narrative. As predicted, the following day's edition of the Cody Enterprise featured the attack more prominently, with the headline "Local Rancher Survives Grizzly Attack, Fights Off Bear with Wrench." The article, while factually accurate in its basic details, employed more dramatic language and included quotes from a retired outfitter describing Hank as tough as nails and exactly the kind of grit Wyoming was built on. A sidebar accompanying the main article reviewed previous bear encounters in the region and included information about appropriate safety measures for those living in bear country. A nurse brought the paper to Hank's room, apparently thinking he would appreciate seeing the coverage. His reaction was a mixture of embarrassment and resignation. "Exactly what I didn't want," he muttered, setting the paper aside after a cursory glance. "It'll blow over," Michael assured him. "Next week someone will catch an unusually large fish or a moose will wander into someone's yard, and that'll be the new local excitement." Hank hoped his son was right, though he suspected the story might have longer legs than anticipated. Human-wildlife conflicts held perennial interest, particularly when they involved charismatic megafauna like grizzly bears and resulted in survival rather than tragedy. The narrative appealed to fundamental aspects of the regional identity: resilience, self-reliance, and coexistence with wilderness. The second full day in the hospital brought improvements in Hank's condition. The wound care remained uncomfortable, but showed no signs of infection developing, a significant concern given the bacterial load typically associated with bear attacks. Physical therapists visited to demonstrate exercises that would help maintain muscle function without compromising the healing process. Hank participated diligently, recognizing that his eventual return to independent ranching would depend on proper rehabilitation. Dr. Reeves conducted a thorough examination and expressed satisfaction with the initial healing progression. "You're doing remarkably well considering the extent of your injuries," he noted while checking the sutures on Hank's back. "No signs of infection, vital signs stable, and you're already pushing the boundaries of our pain management recommendations." This last observation referenced Hank's consistent requests to reduce his pain medication dosage, preferring mental clarity over complete comfort. The medical team had compromised by adjusting the medication schedule to provide maximum coverage during wound care and physical therapy, while allowing lower dosages during other periods. "If this progress continues, we can proceed with discharge tomorrow as planned," Dr. Reeves concluded, "though I want to be absolutely clear about the restrictions you'll need to follow. No weight bearing on that right leg beyond what the physical therapist has demonstrated. No lifting anything heavier than 5 pounds. No independent showering until the wounds have sufficiently healed. And absolutely no return to ranch work for a minimum of 6 weeks, with a gradual reintroduction after medical clearance." Hank acknowledged these instructions without argument, though internally he was already calculating how to accelerate the timeline without compromising his recovery. As a lifelong rancher, extended inactivity presented its own form of discomfort, perhaps less acute than physical pain, but more persistent in its effects on his mental well-being. Later that afternoon, an unexpected visitor arrived. Sheriff Tom Lancaster, this time in an unofficial capacity rather than for investigative purposes. The sheriff, a man in his early 50s with the weathered complexion common to those who spent substantial time outdoors in Wyoming's climate, carried a small duffel bag that he placed on the visitor's chair. "Thought you might want some of your own things," he explained. "Michael gave me his key and a list. Grabbed you some comfortable clothes, your reading glasses, and that paperback I noticed on your nightstand." This thoughtful gesture surprised Hank, as his interactions with Lancaster had historically been limited to community events and occasional professional matters related to the ranch. "To appreciate that, Tom didn't expect special service from the sheriff." Lancaster shrugged. "Not here as the sheriff today, just as a neighbor who's known you going on 20 years. He hesitated before continuing. "Also wanted to let you know that we've had some increased patrol presence around your property. Standard procedure after an incident like this, keeps the curious from trespassing to look for the famous attack site or the bear itself." This information both relieved and irritated Hank. Relief at the protection of his property, irritation at the necessity for such measures. People actually doing that. "Had 2 vehicles parked along the county road yesterday, occupants with binoculars scanning your northeast pasture," Lancaster confirmed. "Moved them along with warnings about trespassing and unnecessary risk, but you know how these things go. People hear grizzly attack, and suddenly everyone's a wildlife photographer or amateur tracker." The conversation shifted to general community matters, providing Hank a welcome distraction from his medical circumstances. Lancaster shared updates on local developments, including ongoing debates about proposed zoning changes that might affect agricultural properties in the county. The normalcy of this discussion offered temporary reprieve from the focus on Hank's injuries and recovery prospects. As evening approached, Lancaster prepared to depart. At the door, he paused and turned back. "Nearly forgot. The department fielded 6 media calls yesterday about your encounter. Bigger outlets than the local paper. Seems the wire services picked up the story, and now the regional news organizations want interviews. Thought you should know they might start calling you directly." This news dismayed Hank. Local coverage was one thing, but wider media attention represented an unwelcome intrusion into his privacy. Not interested in being their wildlife adventure story. Don't they have actual news to report? Lancaster smiled sympathetically. "Man fights off grizzly with a wrench makes for better headlines than county budget discussions. Just giving you a heads up so you're not caught off guard. Feel free to send them my way if they bother you. I've gotten pretty good at providing non-answers that sound informative." After the sheriff's departure, Hank discussed this development with Michael, who proposed screening all calls to the room and eventually changing Hank's cell phone number if the attention persisted. "Could be worse," Michael noted pragmatically. "At least you're not getting requests for product endorsements yet." The official wrench of bear fighters everywhere. This attempt at humor drew a reluctant smile from Hank. "Let's not give them ideas." As night fell, Hank found sleep increasingly elusive, despite the physical exhaustion and medication. Whenever he closed his eyes, sensory memories of the attack surfaced with disturbing clarity. The bear's musky odor, the sound of its breathing, the sensation of claws tearing through flesh. These recollections triggered physiological responses, increased heart rate, shallow breathing, muscle tension, that the monitoring equipment dutifully recorded, bringing a nurse to check on him several times throughout the night. "Nightmares are common after traumatic events," she explained during one such visit, adjusting his IV with practiced efficiency. "Your brain is processing what happened. It should improve gradually, but let the doctor know tomorrow if you'd like something to help you sleep." Hank declined this suggestion, preferring to manage the psychological aftermath without additional medication if possible. Throughout his life, he had faced challenges directly rather than seeking chemical mitigation, and he intended to maintain this approach despite the unprecedented nature of his current situation. Morning brought the anticipated discharge procedures, final examinations, medication instructions, scheduling of follow-up appointments, and detailed wound care protocols. The physical therapist provided printed exercise instructions with clear illustrations and timelines for progression. Her social worker visited briefly to discuss potential psychological impacts of traumatic injuries and provide resources should Hank experience symptoms of post-traumatic stress requiring professional intervention. By early afternoon, the discharge process was complete. Michael brought the truck around to the hospital's main entrance, while an orderly helped Hank navigate the transition from bed to wheelchair. Hospital policy required all discharged patients to exit via wheelchair, regardless of mobility status. The simple act of transferring from the bed to the chair reinforced the severity of Hank's injuries, as movements he would normally perform without thought now required careful planning and caused considerable discomfort despite his medication. The transition from the wheelchair to the passenger seat of Michael's truck presented similar challenges. The hospital staff had provided a specialized cushion to minimize pressure on his injuries during the 2-hour drive to Billings, but no amount of preparation could entirely eliminate the discomfort of travel in his condition. As they pulled away from the hospital, Hank caught a glimpse of a man with a camera near the parking lot exit, though Michael accelerated past before any photographs could be taken. "Reporter," Michael explained tersely. "They've been hanging around since this morning, according to the security guard. Told me to exit through the south side to avoid most of them." Hank sighed, closing his eyes briefly against the midday sunlight filtering through the windshield. "How long do you figure this will keep up?" Michael shrugged, his attention focused on navigating through Cody's modest traffic. "Few days, probably. Local story will die down first, then the regional interest. Unless something happens with that specific bear that connects back to your case, it'll fade from the news cycle pretty quickly." The drive to Billings proceeded, steadily along US Highway 310, the familiar landscape passing outside the windows as they traveled north. Under normal circumstances, Hank would have appreciated the views of the Pryor Mountains to the east and the Beartooth Range to the west, but today his focus remained internal, divided between managing his physical discomfort and processing the events that had so dramatically altered his circumstances. Conversation between father and son occurred in sporadic bursts rather than continuous exchange, a communication pattern established over decades of shared work where speech served practical purposes rather than social ones. Michael provided updates on ranch matters. Rodriguez had reported the cattle were in good condition, the irrigation system was functioning properly for the fall watering schedule, and no equipment issues had emerged in Hank's absence. Hank acknowledged this information with brief responses, conserving energy as the medication that had been administered before discharge gradually diminished in effectiveness. They stopped once at a rest area near Warren, Michael helping his father navigate the challenging process of using the facilities with limited mobility. The necessary dependence on assistance for basic functions reinforced Hank's awareness of his temporarily diminished capabilities, a reality he accepted with outward stoicism, despite the internal frustration it generated. Arrival at Michael's home in Billings brought new adjustments. The house, a comfortable 2-story in a relatively new subdivision, reflected Michael's more contemporary lifestyle, his work as a civil engineer for the Montana Department of Transportation, providing a stable income that supported amenities Hank had never prioritized on the ranch. The promised hospital bed had been delivered and set up in the ground floor guest room, complete with adjacent medical supplies and mobility aids. Michael's wife, Karen, herself a registered nurse at Billings Clinic, had arranged her work schedule to provide professional monitoring during Hank's initial recovery period. Their children, Jason, 14, and Megan, 11, had been prepared for their grandfather's arrival and the adjustments it would require of the household. Their cautious observation of Hank's slow, assisted progress from vehicle to bedroom revealed both concern and curiosity about his injuries. "Can we see where the bear got you, Grandpa?" Jason asked once Hank was settled in the hospital bed, his directness earning a reproving look from Karen. "Not much to see right now except bandages," Hank replied, finding a measure of comfort in his grandson's straightforward interest rather than the careful avoidance the adults had maintained. "Once they're changed, I'll show you the claw marks on my back. Going to have some impressive scars." This promise visibly pleased Jason, while simultaneously alarming Karen, who quickly interjected, "We'll see about that when the time comes. Right now, Grandpa needs to rest and take his medication." The medication in question, oral antibiotics and pain management prescriptions, arrived promptly with a glass of water and Karen's professional oversight. Her nursing experience evident. In the efficient way, she arranged Hank's surroundings for maximum convenience, while explaining the medication schedule with clarity that balanced her professional knowledge with consideration for his independence. "I've set alarms on this bedside clock for when each medication needs to be taken," she explained. "The button here will call through to our phones if you need anything between checks. We'll be coming in regularly for the first few days to monitor your condition, but please use the button if you need something sooner." Hank nodded, genuinely appreciative of these arrangements, while simultaneously hoping to require minimal intervention. Throughout his adult life, he had managed his needs independently, and this sudden dependence, however medically necessary, challenged his self-concept in ways the physical injuries alone did not. The remainder of the day passed in a cycle of medication, rest, and brief family interactions. Michael's children approached their grandfather's presence with typical adolescent oscillation between interest and self-absorption, checking in periodically with questions about the bear encounter before returning to their normal activities. Karen monitored Hank's vital signs with professional thoroughness while maintaining conversational normalcy that helped prevent him from feeling reduced to a medical case. Evening brought the first wound care procedure in the home setting. Karen's professional experience proved invaluable as she changed the dressings with practiced efficiency, minimizing discomfort while ensuring proper cleaning and application of prescribed topical treatments. The revealed injuries, still raw and prominently sutured, provided stark visual evidence of the encounter's severity. "Looking better than I expected, actually," Karen commented as she applied fresh bandages to his calf. Good capillary refill around the wound edges, no signs of infection or excessive inflammation. The surgical team did excellent work with the debridement and closure. As promised, Hank allowed Jason a brief view of the claw marks across his back during the dressing change, the teenager's expression shifting from excited anticipation to sobered realization as he observed the actual damage. "Does it hurt a lot?" Jason asked, his voice quieter than his earlier enthusiastic questioning. "It's manageable," Hank replied, not mentioning the waves of pain that accompanied even minor movements or the persistent throbbing that the medication merely dulled rather than eliminated. Some realities remained inappropriate to share with children, regardless of their expressed interest. Night brought new challenges as Hank attempted to find comfortable positions for sleep in the unfamiliar hospital bed. Despite the superior medical functionality, compared to his decades-old mattress at the ranch, the specialized bed felt confining. After a lifetime of sleeping in spaces of his own design, the prescribed pain medication, taken at a reduced dosage at his insistence, provided insufficient relief for truly restful sleep, but enough sedation to create a disorienting half-consciousness where time passed in irregular increments. During these hours, Hank's thoughts returned repeatedly to the attack, not in the vivid flashbacks that had characterized his hospital stay, but in analytical review of the encounter and his responses. He replayed each moment, identifying decisions that might have altered the outcome had different choices been made. The assessment wasn't self-recrimination so much as the habitual analysis he applied to all significant events, seeking lessons that might improve future outcomes. Morning arrived with Karen's professional entry, checking vital signs and administering medication before the household's regular activities began. Breakfast followed, delivered on a tray that could be positioned across the hospital bed for convenience. The meal itself was nutritionally appropriate for his recovery needs, but conspicuously different from his typical ranch breakfast: oatmeal with fruit rather than eggs and bacon, decaffeinated coffee instead of his usual strong brew, portions carefully measured rather than absent-mindedly served. "I checked your ranch email," Michael mentioned when he arrived with a tablet after the meal had been cleared away. Game and Fish sent an update on their monitoring of the attack area. No sign of the bear returning, though they've identified tracks from other wildlife investigating the site, probably attracted by the blood scent initially. Hank nodded, unsurprised by this information. Predators typically avoided locations where they had experienced negative outcomes, particularly when those experiences included physical injury. Unless food scarcity became extreme, GB247 would likely maintain distance from the specific attack location indefinitely. "They're keeping the cameras in place for another week as a precaution," Michael continued, reading from the email. They've also issued an advisory to neighboring properties, though they're emphasizing that this appears to be an isolated incident, rather than an indication of increased risk throughout the area. The first physical therapy session occurred mid-morning, conducted by a therapist who made home visits for patients unable to attend clinic appointments. The exercises, while basic, proved challenging given Hank's injuries and the 4-day period of relative immobility since the attack. Simple movements designed to maintain joint function and prevent muscle atrophy required concentration and tolerance for discomfort beyond what Hank had anticipated. "You're doing well for someone who was wrestling a grizzly less than a week." "Hugus," the therapist commented as she guided him through gentle range of motion exercises for his injured shoulder. "The better we maintain function now, the faster your recovery will progress once the wounds themselves have healed." The remainder of the day established what would become Hank's routine during recovery: medication schedules, regular monitoring, physical therapy exercises, and the gradual introduction of limited mobility, using a walker to navigate short distances within the house. The rhythm of these activities provided structure, but emphasized the dramatic departure from his normal, independent existence. By evening, the cumulative effects of physical exertion, medication, and the psychological adjustment to his circumstances left Hank exhausted beyond his typical capacity. Sleep came more readily than the previous night, though it remained fragmented by position changes necessitated by his injuries and the persistent discomfort that even optimal medication management couldn't entirely eliminate. The following days established a pattern of incremental improvements balanced against the frustrations of dependency. Physical therapy progressed from basic movements to more functional exercises. Wound care revealed gradual healing, with inflammation receding and the initial stages of tissue regeneration becoming visible. Mobility improved from walker-assisted, walking to crutches that allowed greater independence but still required substantial upper body strength that taxed Hank's injured shoulder. Communication with Eduardo Rodriguez provided regular updates on ranch operations. The experienced neighboring rancher managed essential tasks efficiently, though Hank noted several decisions that differed from his own preferred approaches. These variations, while minor in practical impact, reinforced his awareness of displacement from his normal role and environment. 1 week into his stay at Michael's home, Diane Mercer from Game and Fish called with an update that captured Hank's full attention. "We've identified GB-217 approximately 12 miles north of the attack site," she reported. Trail cameras in the Polecat Bench area captured him moving through an ungrazed section of BLM land. He appears to be favoring his right side slightly, likely from the injuries you inflicted while defending yourself, but otherwise moving normally and demonstrating typical foraging behavior. This information produced an unexpected emotional response in Hank, a complex mixture of relief that the bear had survived their encounter, concern about its continued presence in relatively accessible terrain, and a strange sense of connection to the animal that had so dramatically altered his life's trajectory. "He heading deeper into less populated areas?" Hank asked, his practical concern for both human safety and the bear's welfare evident in the question. "That's our assessment based on movement patterns," Mercer confirmed. "He's following food sources away from human activity centers, as we would expect during this season. The facial injury doesn't appear to be impeding his foraging success, and he's showing no signs of seeking human food sources or habitation areas." After concluding the call, Hank sat quietly in the hospital bed contemplating this update. The bear's continued existence represented both an ongoing potential risk to humans in the region and a testament to the resilience of the species in adapting to shared landscapes. Like Hank himself, GB-2117 was recovering from their violent intersection, each carrying physical evidence of the encounter but returning to their respective territories and routines. 2 weeks into recovery, Hank received clearance from his physicians to return to the ranch with specific limitations on activities and requirements for continued wound care and physical therapy. This transition required extensive preparation, arrangement of home health visits, modification of the ranch house to accommodate his limited mobility, and establishment of support systems for tasks beyond his current capabilities. The return itself, accompanied by Michael, who had arranged a week's leave from work to assist with the transition, evoked mixed emotions. The familiar landscape triggered both comfort at homecoming and uncomfortable memories of the attack itself. Passing the northeast fence line where the encounter had occurred produced a visceral reaction: increased heart rate, shallow breathing, hyper-awareness of surroundings, that Hank acknowledged without comment while Michael navigated the property roads with deliberate casualness. The ranch house, unchanged in appearance yet somehow different in Hank's perception, required navigation with crutches that transformed familiar spaces into obstacle courses of potential hazards. Rooms seemed simultaneously smaller due to his decreased mobility and larger in the effort required to traverse them. The adjustments continued throughout that first day of return. Shower chair installation, rearrangement of kitchen items for seated accessibility, relocation of ranch management paperwork to main floor areas rather than the office upstairs. That evening, seated in his familiar recliner with elevated leg and carefully positioned support pillows, Hank watched the sunset through the west-facing windows. The view captured the silhouette of the Absaroka Range against the darkening sky, the sea, same mountains that sheltered the wilderness from which GB-2017 had descended. In this moment of contemplation, Hank recognized that his relationship with the landscape had fundamentally changed. The controlled comfort of ranching an area bordering wilderness had been disrupted by the vivid reminder of nature's unpredictability and power. The following days established new routines within the familiar setting. Eduardo Rodriguez continued handling livestock management, with Hank providing direction from the house based on reports rather than direct observation. Physical therapists visited 3 times weekly, gradually increasing the intensity and duration of exercises as healing progressed. A home health nurse evaluated wound healing and adjusted care protocols to match recovery stages. Michael returned to Billings with promises of weekend visits until Hank regained sufficient independence. Alone in the ranch house for the first time since the attack, Hank confronted the psychological aftermath more directly than the constant presence of family had previously allowed. The creak of the house settling at night triggered momentary alertness. The wind against the windows occasionally sounded like heavy breathing in his half-sleep state. Dreams frequently returned to the attack, sometimes replaying events as they had occurred other times, creating alternate scenarios where his defense failed or where escape remained impossible. He woke from these episodes with racing heart and sweat-dampened sheets, the phantom sensation of claws and teeth persisting into wakefulness. 3 weeks after his return to the ranch, Game and Fish removed the trail cameras from the attack site, having documented no return visits by the bear and observing normal wildlife patterns resuming in the area. Diane Mercer called to inform Hank of this development and provide a final update on GB-217's monitored movements. He's established a pattern that suggests denning preparation, she explained, moving higher into the mountains, focusing on high-calorie food sources and showing the increased feeding activity, typical of pre-hibernation behavior. We expect he'll select a denning site within the next 2 to 3 weeks, depending on weather patterns and food availability. This natural conclusion to the bear's season provided a symbolic endpoint to the immediate phase of Hank's recovery as well. The physical wounds had progressed from acute injury to healing process. Sutures removed, tissue regeneration advancing, function gradually returning through consistent therapy. The partially reconstructed ear would never regain its original appearance, and the calf injury would likely cause permanent gait alterations despite optimal rehabilitation, but these outcomes represented adaptation rather than disability in Hank's assessment. The psychological recovery followed a less linear progression. Heightened alertness persisted, particularly when working in areas of the property where visibility was limited or wildlife signs were present. The familiar sounds and scents of the ranch environment occasionally triggered momentary flashbacks to the attack, though their intensity and duration decreased with time and repeated exposure. Sleep gradually improved as exhaustion from increased physical activity during recovery overtook the disruptive patterns established immediately following the trauma. 6 weeks after the attack, with medical clearance for limited independent activities, Hank drove his truck to the northeast fence line where the encounter had occurred. This deliberate confrontation with the specific location represented a personal milestone in his recovery, acknowledging the event while demonstrating to himself that the site held no inherent danger beyond its proximity to wilderness habitat. The area showed little evidence of what had transpired. Fall rains had washed away blood traces, wind had redistributed disturbed soil, and normal animal traffic had incorporated the location back into regular movement patterns. The fence repair he had begun that October morning remained incomplete, sections of wire still requiring reattachment, where he had abandoned the task during the bear's approach. Hank stood beside his truck, surveying the landscape with the heightened awareness that had become his constant companion since the attack. The experience had fundamentally altered his perception of the environment, not with fear precisely, but with a deeper recognition of his position within the natural order. His decades of ranching had created a sense of management and control that the bear had disrupted in moments of primal interaction. From the truck bed, Hank retrieved the tools required to complete the fence repair: wire, pliers, and a new adjustable wrench to replace the one damaged during his defense. The original wrench had been recovered by game and fish personnel during their investigation, its metal surface visibly bent and bearing traces of both his blood and the bear's. Diane Mercer had offered to return it once their documentation was complete, but Hank had declined. Some artifacts of experience belonged to memory rather than physical possession. Working methodically despite the lingering limitations of his injuries, Hank completed the fence repair that had been interrupted 6 weeks earlier. The process required additional time and incorporated frequent rest periods, but the fundamental skills remained intact. Each secured section of wire represented reclamation of purpose, acknowledging changed circumstances while affirming continuing capability. As he packed tools back into the truck, movement in his peripheral vision caused an immediate physiological response. Elevated heart rate, muscle tension, focused attention. A mule deer had emerged from the tree line approximately 100 yards away, pausing to assess his presence before continuing across the open ground. The animal's cautious progress mirrored Hank's own approach to the transformed relationship, with his environment alert to potential threat while continuing necessary movement through shared territory. Returning to the ranch house, Hank placed the new wrench in his toolbox with deliberate care. The tool now carried significance beyond its practical function, a symbol of adaptability and resilience rather than merely an implement for mechanical tasks. In his pocket, he felt the weight of the revolver he had begun carrying during outdoor work, a .357 Magnum with sufficient stopping power for defensive purposes without excessive weight or bulk. The weapon represented neither fear nor aggression, but practical adjustment to demonstrated risk, much like the increased awareness that accompanied his movements through the property. That evening, seated on his porch as daylight faded across the landscape, Hank contemplated the bear that had altered his life's trajectory. GB217 would likely be entering hibernation soon, metabolic processes slowing as it entered the den it had prepared for winter survival. Come spring, it would emerge to resume its role in the ecosystem, hunting, foraging, perhaps mating, ultimately fulfilling the biological imperatives that had evolved over millennia of adaptation to the northern Rockies environment. Hank's own imperatives continued without seasonal suspension. The ranch required management through winter conditions, livestock needed care regardless of weather patterns, and the business of agricultural production maintained its relentless schedule. His participation would remain modified by physical limitations for months to come, perhaps permanently in some aspects, but the fundamental responsibilities endured unchanged. As darkness settled over the property, Hank watched the first stars appear in the eastern sky. The vastness above echoed the wilderness beyond his fence lines, spaces where natural processes operated according to ancient patterns, regardless of human designations or intentions. The attack had provided visceral reminder of his participation in these patterns rather than separation from them, a lesson delivered through tooth and claw, rather than intellectual understanding. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, physical therapy exercises that pushed recovering muscles to greater function, wound care that tracked healing progress, ranch management decisions requiring adaptation to his current capabilities. The future beyond held uncertainties regarding full recovery potential, possible long-term limitations, and adjustments to ranching operations that might become necessary. Yet the fundamental rhythm would continue. Sunrise to sunset, season to season, the careful stewardship of land and animals that had defined his existence for decades. The revolver would remain within reach during outdoor work, its weight a constant reminder of changed circumstances. The scars would remain visible on body and psyche, testimony to momentary intersection with wildness that had altered lifetime patterns. Yet Hank Miller would continue, marked but undefeated, cautious but undeterred, carrying physical evidence of nature's power, while maintaining his chosen place within its systems. In the darkness beyond the porch light's reach, nighthawks called as they hunted insects in the open air above the pastures. The sound represented continuation, the enduring cycles of predator and prey, of human and wildlife occupying shared landscapes with separate purposes and occasional intersection. Hank rose from his chair with the careful movements his injuries still required, glancing once toward the mountains before turning toward the lighted doorway of his home. "Never again," he murmured, touching the revolver in his pocket as he stepped inside. The door closed behind him, separating domestic space from wilderness beyond, a boundary maintained with full knowledge of its permeability, respected rather than trusted for the protection it provided. Now let's move on to the story of the next survivor. The morning mist hung low over the forest floor of Baxter State Park, a sprawling wilderness in northern Maine. Rachel Nguyen adjusted her backpack, the weight of her recording equipment pressing against her shoulders as she navigated through the underbrush. At 24, she was in the final stages of her graduate research on avian communication patterns, a project that had consumed the last 2 years of her life at the University of Maine. Her thesis focused on how urbanization affected bird calls, but she needed comparative data from pristine environments, places like this remote corner of Baxter, where human influence remained minimal. Rachel checked her GPS coordinates against the map she'd marked with potential recording sites. This particular location promised a diverse soundscape, nestled as it was between dense forest and a small clearing that attracted various bird species. She'd arrived at the park yesterday afternoon, set up camp at Roaring Brook Campground, and spent the evening organizing her equipment. Today would be her first full day of fieldwork, and she planned to start early to capture the dawn chorus. The air was crisp with early autumn, carrying the earthy scent of decaying leaves and pine. Rachel breathed deeply, appreciating the stillness that was so unlike her cramped apartment in Orono. Here, miles from traffic noise and conversation, she could finally capture pure, uncontaminated bird vocalizations. Her thesis advisor, Dr. Wilson, had encouraged this expedition despite the approaching deadline. "Field data is what will set your research apart," he'd insisted, and Rachel knew he was right. She reached the clearing she'd identified on her map and began unpacking her equipment methodically. First came the parabolic microphone, her most valuable tool, designed to capture distant sounds with remarkable clarity. Next, she set up her digital recorder and checked its battery level, fully charged, enough for 8 hours of continuous recording. Finally, she positioned 3 smaller omnidirectional microphones in a triangular pattern to capture the surrounding soundscape. Rachel pulled her dark hair into a tight ponytail and slipped on her headphones, immediately immersed in the amplified sounds of the forest. A white-throated sparrow's clear whistle cut through the background noise. Old Sam Peabody, 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 as her ornithology professor had taught her to hear it. She adjusted the gain on her recorder, smiling at the perfect clarity of the call. What Rachel failed to notice as she focused intently on the bird sounds filtering through her headphones was the subtle movement in the thicket about 50 yards to her right. A medium-sized black bear, drawn perhaps by curiosity or the scent of the granola bars in her backpack, had paused its morning foraging to observe the human intruder. The bear, a 3-year-old male recently independent from its mother, had been feeding on late-season berries and grubs, building its fat reserves for the approaching winter. In her log, Rachel noted the time, 7:42 a.m., and began documenting the bird species she identified. Her concentration was absolute, her awareness narrowed to the sounds coming through her headphones and the notes she was taking. The rustle of leaves and snap of twigs that might have alerted her to the bear's approach were lost beneath the amplified bird song. The bear moved cautiously, its natural wariness of humans competing with its curiosity. It had encountered humans before, mostly hikers who shouted and made themselves appear large, prompting it to retreat into the safety of the forest. But this human was different, quiet, stationary, seemingly unaware of its surroundings. The bear approached closer, moving with surprising stealth for an animal weighing close to 200 pounds. At 8:17 a.m., Rachel captured a particularly interesting call pattern from what she believed was a Blackburnian warbler, an uncommon species. This late in the season, excited, she adjusted her position, taking a few steps backward without looking, directly into the path of the approaching bear. The collision was mutual surprise. Rachel felt something solid against her legs and turned, her headphones slipping, off as she moved. The bear, startled by the sudden movement, reared up on its hind legs, not in aggression, but in an instinctive response to better assess the threat. To Rachel, however, the sight of a black bear rising to its full 5-foot height just yards away triggered an immediate panic response. She screamed and stumbled backward, tripping over her own equipment. The parabolic microphone crashed too, the ground as Rachel fell, the sound startling the bear further. For a crucial moment, both human and animal froze, assessing each other in a tableau of mutual fear. Rachel's mind raced through the bear safety protocols she'd reviewed before. Her trip. Don't run. Make yourself look big. Back away slowly. But fear overrode her training and, as the bear dropped to all fours, she scrambled backward, her movements jerky and panicked. The bear, conflicted between flight and investigation, took a hesitant step forward. In the wild calculus of predator and prey, Rachel's retreat registered. As vulnerability, the animal advanced again, now within 10 feet of where she had landed among her scattered equipment. "Hey!" Rachel shouted, finally remembering to make noise. "Get away!" Her voice echoed through the clearing, startling a flock of chickadees into flight. The bear paused, head lowered, assessing this new development. Rachel reached for her backpack, searching frantically for the bear spray she'd purchased at the ranger station yesterday. Her fingers closed around the canister, just as the bear decided to approach again, perhaps drawn by the food scents in her pack. In her haste, Rachel fumbled the bear spray, failing to remove the safety tab properly. The bear was now close enough that she could see its eyes, small, dark, and unreadable, and smell its wild, musky odor. Abandoning the spray, she grabbed the nearest object, her aluminum water bottle, and hurled it at the animal. The bottle struck the bear's shoulder, eliciting not retreat but a warning huff. The animal's lips curled back, revealing yellowed teeth. This was no longer curiosity but agitation. Rachel knew she had made a critical error. She should have played dead for a defensive attack or fought back for a predatory one. But which was this? The distinction blurred in her panic. She tried to stand to make herself appear larger, but her right foot caught in the strap of her equipment bag, and she stumbled again. The bear lunged forward, covering the remaining distance in a burst of speed that belied its bulky frame. Rachel felt a searing pain as the animal's teeth closed around her ankle, puncturing through her hiking boot and into flesh. She screamed, a primal sound that tore from her throat without conscious thought. Instinctively, she kicked with her free leg, her boot connecting with the bear's sensitive nose. The animal released her ankle with a grunt of pain or surprise, backing up several steps. Rachel seized the moment to pull herself backward, dragging her injured leg, leaving a thin trail of blood on the forest floor. The bear shook its head, pawing at its muzzle where Rachel's kick had landed. This momentary distraction gave her precious seconds to reach her backpack again. This time her fingers found the bear spray, and she managed to disengage the safety. The bear recovered and approached again, its movements now deliberate, focused. Rachel aimed the canister and pressed the trigger, praying the spray would work at this distance. A cloud of capsaicin erupted from the canister, caught by the light morning breeze and carried directly into the bear's face. The effect was immediate. The animal recoiled, snorting and pawing frantically at its eyes and nose. It shook its head violently, trying to escape the burning sensation, and backed away several more steps. Rachel continued to spray until the canister was nearly empty, creating a barrier of irritant between herself and the bear. Whimpering in pain, the confused and distressed animal turned and lumbered back into the forest, disappearing into the underbrush with surprising speed. Rachel remained frozen. Bear spray still held out before her for several long minutes after the sound of crashing vegetation had faded. Only when she was certain the bear had truly retreated did she allow herself to assess her injury. Her hiking boot was torn, the leather punctured in several places where the bear's teeth had penetrated. Blood seeped from the wounds, staining her sock a deep crimson. When she attempted to stand, white-hot pain shot up her leg, forcing her back to the ground with a cry. Rachel's hands shook violently as she reached for her backpack, searching for her first aid kit and cell phone. The kit contained basic supplies: antiseptic wipes, bandages, gauze, but nothing adequate for puncture wounds that might already be infected with bacteria from the bear's mouth. And her phone, when she checked it, showed no service, not unexpected, in this remote area of the park. She was alone, injured, at least 3 miles from the nearest campground, with a potentially aggressive bear still in the vicinity. Rachel forced herself to breathe deeply, fighting the rising tide of panic that threatened to overwhelm her. "Think," she whispered to herself. "Think logically." First, she needed to clean and bandage the wound as best she could to prevent immediate infection. Using the antiseptic wipes from her kit, she gingerly cleaned around the punctures, wincing at each touch. The bleeding had slowed but not stopped completely. She applied gauze pads and wrapped her ankle tightly with an elastic bandage, hoping it would provide enough stability for her to walk. Next, she needed to gather her essential equipment. Her research materials were valuable, but she couldn't carry everything in her current condition. She salvaged her digital recorder, 1 microphone, and her notebook, packing them alongside her water, energy bars, and remaining first aid supplies. Standing proved challenging. Rachel used a fallen branch as a makeshift walking stick, leaning heavily on it as she tested her weight on the injured ankle. The pain was intense but manageable if she kept most of her weight on her left leg. She oriented herself using her compass and the trail markers she'd noted earlier, and began the slow journey back toward Roaring Brook Campground. Every step was an exercise in determination. What would normally have been an hour's hike stretched before her as an ordeal of unknown duration. The forest that had seemed so peaceful that morning now felt oppressive, full of hidden dangers. Every rustle in the underbrush made her heart race, fearing the bear's return. Rachel checked her watch. 10:22 a.m. If she maintained a steady pace, even with her injury, she might reach the campground by early afternoon. Other hikers or park rangers would be there, people who could help her reach medical care. She just needed to keep moving. The pain in her ankle grew more intense as she walked, the initial shock wearing off to reveal the true extent of the injury. Rachel paused every 15 minutes to rest, elevating her leg when possible and checking the bandage for fresh bleeding. By her third rest stop, she noticed the area around the punctures had begun to swell noticeably, stretching the elastic bandage tight. As she navigated a particularly rough section of trail, Rachel's makeshift walking stick snapped, sending her stumbling to her knees. The impact jarred her injured ankle, and she bit back a scream, tears springing to her eyes. For a moment she remained on the ground, overwhelmed by pain and the enormity of her situation. "You can do this," she told herself firmly. One step at a time. She found another branch, sturdier than the first, and pulled herself upright again. The forest canopy had thickened, making it difficult to gauge the time from the position of the sun, but her watch showed it was approaching. Noon? Rachel had covered perhaps a mile when she heard voices ahead, other hikers on the trail. Relief flooded through her, and she called out, her voice cracking with emotion. "Help! I need help!" A moment later, 2 figures appeared around a bend in the trail, a middle-aged couple equipped with day packs and trekking poles. Their expressions shifted from surprise to concern as they took in Rachel's disheveled appearance and obvious injury. "What happened?" the woman asked, rushing forward to support Rachel as she swayed on her makeshift crutch. "Bear attack," Rachel managed, the words sounding surreal even as she spoke them. "It bit my ankle. I need to get to a ranger station or hospital." The man, who introduced himself as Mike Collins, examined her bandaged ankle with a grimace. "I was an EMT before I retired," he explained. "Let me take a better look at this." His wife, Linda, helped Rachel sit on a fallen log while Mike carefully unwrapped the soaked bandage. His sharp intake of breath told Rachel more than words could about the condition of her wound. "These are deep punctures," he said, his voice professionally calm despite the concern in his eyes. "And there's already significant swelling and redness. We need to get you to medical care as soon as possible." While Mike reapplied a clean bandage from his own more comprehensive first aid kit, Linda used a satellite phone to call the park ranger station. "They're sending someone with a stretcher," she reported after a brief conversation. "They should be here within the hour. The ranger also wants to know about the bear, location, size, behavior." Rachel provided what details she could remember, her academic training asserting itself even through her pain. "Male black bear, probably young adult based on size, approximately 200 pounds. Initial behavior was investigative rather than predatory. Attack seemed defensive, triggered. When I startled it and then threw something at it. Mike raised an eyebrow, impressed by her detailed observation despite the trauma. You handled it well, he said, securing the fresh bandage. Bear spray was the right call. Many people freeze up completely in that situation. The wait for the Rangers seemed interminable, though Linda's watch showed only 40 minutes had passed when they heard the rescue team approaching. 2 park rangers appeared, carrying a collapsible stretcher between them, followed by a third with a medical kit. The lead ranger, whose name tag identified her as Ranger Martinez, knelt beside Rachel. I'm Maria Martinez, head ranger for this section of the park. We're going to get you out of here and to a hospital. Can you tell me exactly what happened while my colleagues prepare the stretcher? Rachel recounted the encounter again, more coherently this time. Ranger Martinez took notes, asking occasional questions about the bear's specific behaviors and the exact location of the attack. We'll send a team to collect your remaining equipment, the ranger assured her. Right. Now our priority is getting you medical attention. Bear bites can cause serious infections if not treated promptly. The other rangers had prepared the stretcher, and with careful movements, they helped Rachel onto it. The pain had become a constant throb, and she noticed with alarm that she could no longer move her toes without intense discomfort. We have an ambulance waiting at the trailhead, Ranger Martinez explained as they secured Rachel to the stretcher. It's about a mile from here. Dr. Caroline Fletcher from Millinocket Regional Hospital will be treating you. She has experience with wildlife injuries. The journey out was smoother than Rachel's solo attempt, but still jarring as the rangers navigated the uneven terrain. They moved efficiently, clearly trained for wilderness evacuations. Mike and Linda Collins walked alongside for a while before Ranger Martinez thanked them and assured them Rachel would be well cared for. At the trailhead, the promised ambulance waited, its emergency lights casting intermittent red flashes across the surrounding trees. 2 paramedics transferred Rachel from the ranger's stretcher to the ambulance gurney, immediately checking her vital signs and starting an IV line. Pulse elevated but steady, one reported. BP 140 over 90. Probable infection setting in at wound site. The other paramedic administered pain medication through the IV, bringing blessed relief within minutes. As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle began moving, Rachel felt the adrenaline that had sustained her finally ebbing, replaced by a profound exhaustion. You're going to be fine, the female paramedic assured her, noticing her drooping eyelids. We'll be at the hospital in 20 minutes. Try to rest if you can. Rachel drifted in and out of consciousness during the drive, the medication creating a dissociative buffer between her and the pain. Images flashed behind her closed. Eyelids, the bear rising on its hind legs, the blur of movement as it lunged, the terrifying moment when its teeth closed around her ankle. She jerked awake with a gasp, momentarily disoriented. Easy, the paramedic soothed. You're safe now. We're almost there. The ambulance pulled into the emergency entrance of Millinocket Regional Hospital, a modest facility that nevertheless served as the primary medical center for the region's wilderness injuries. Rachel was wheeled directly into a treatment room, where a team awaited, led by a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and commanding presence. I'm Dr. Fletcher, she introduced herself, already examining the bandaged ankle. I understand you had an encounter with one of our local bears. Let's see what we're dealing with. The removal of the field dressing revealed the full extent of Rachel's injury. 4 distinct puncture wounds marked her ankle where the bear's canine teeth had penetrated, surrounded by swollen, discolored tissue. Dr. Fletcher probed gently around the wounds, her expression grave. The good news is it doesn't appear to have damaged any major tendons or blood vessels, she explained. The bad news is there's already infection setting in, which is common with animal bites. We need to clean these wounds thoroughly, which I'm afraid will be quite uncomfortable even with local anesthesia. Rachel nodded, too exhausted to speak. The next hour passed in a blur of pain as Dr. Fletcher debrided the wounds, removing damaged tissue and flushing the punctures with antiseptic solution. Each irrigation sent fresh waves of agony through Rachel's leg, despite the medication. We'll need to keep these wounds open to drain, Dr. Fletcher explained as she worked. Closing them would trap bacteria inside. I'm also starting you on broad-spectrum antibiotics immediately. Bear mouths harbor numerous bacteria that can cause serious infections. When the painful procedure was finally complete, Rachel's ankle, was wrapped in sterile dressings, and she was admitted to the hospital for observation. Her room on the second floor overlooked the hospital's small parking lot, with the forest visible in the distance, a reminder of the wilderness that had so quickly transformed from research site to danger zone. A nurse helped Rachel settle into the hospital bed, adjusting pillows to elevate her injured leg. Dr. Fletcher has ordered pain medication every 4 hours, she explained, hanging a new IV bag, and the antibiotics will run continuously for the next 24 hours. Try to get some rest now. The doctor will check on you again this evening. Left. Alone, Rachel finally had time to process the day's events. The attack had happened just hours ago, yet it felt like days had passed. She reached for her phone on the bedside table. Someone had plugged it into charge, and saw several missed calls from her advisor, Dr. Wilson. The ranger station must have contacted the university. She dialed his number, suddenly craving the familiar comfort of academic conversation, something normal to counterbalance the surreal quality of the day. "Rachel," Dr. Wilson answered on the first ring, his voice tight with concern. "Ranger Martinez called me. Are you all right? They said a bear attacked you." "I'm at Millinocket Regional," Rachel confirmed, her voice sounding strange in her own ears. "Black bear bit my ankle. They're worried about infection, but the doctor says no major physical damage." There was a pause before Dr. Wilson spoke, again his tone gentler. "That must have been terrifying. Do you need me to come up there? I could be there by tonight." The offer brought unexpected tears to Rachel's eyes. "No," she managed after a moment. "I'm okay. They'll probably keep me for a couple of days. Then I can come back to campus. But my equipment—" She broke off, suddenly remembering the expensive recording gear she'd left scattered at the attack site. "Don't worry about the equipment," Dr. Wilson said firmly. "The department's insurance will cover it. The Rangers said they'd collect everything anyway. Your safety is what matters." After reassuring her advisor that she was receiving good care, Rachel ended the call and sank back against the pillows. The pain medication was making her drowsy, but her mind continued to replay the attack in vivid detail. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the bear's face inches from her own, felt the terrible pressure as its jaws closed around her ankle. A light knock at the door roused her from these unpleasant recollections. Ranger Martinez entered, still in uniform, but without her field gear. "Ms. Nguyen, how are you feeling? I hope I'm not disturbing you." "No, please come in," Rachel said, grateful for the distraction from her thoughts. "They've got me on some pretty strong painkillers, but I'm coherent." The ranger pulled a chair next to the bed. "I wanted to update you on what's happening with your case. We've sent a team to the attack site to retrieve your equipment. They're also setting up trail cameras to identify the bear." She paused, her expression serious. "I also need to ask you some additional questions for our incident report. If you feel up to it." Rachel nodded, and for the next half hour, she answered Ranger Martinez's detailed questions about the encounter, the bear's specific behaviors, the sequence of events, her actions before and during the attack. The ranger recorded her responses on an official form, occasionally asking for clarification. "Based on your description, this sounds like a case of a curious bear that was startled into defensive aggression," Martinez concluded. "Not predatory behavior. That's actually good news. It means the bear wasn't specifically targeting humans as prey, which would require more drastic management action." "What will happen to the bear?" Rachel asked, surprised by her own concern for the animal that had injured her. "We'll monitor the area closely," the ranger explained. "If we can identify it from trail cameras and it shows no further aggressive behavior, we'll likely leave it alone. One defensive incident doesn't necessarily make it a problem bear, but we'll post warnings for hikers in that area for the rest of the season." Before leaving, Ranger Martinez handed Rachel a card. "This is my direct number. Call me if you remember any other details about the incident or if you have questions about the park's response." And she hesitated, her professional demeanor softening slightly. "If you need to talk about the experience, wildlife attacks can have psychological impacts that emerge after the physical danger has passed." After the ranger departed, a hospital social worker visited briefly, providing Rachel with information about trauma counseling resources. Many people experience anxiety, flashbacks, or sleep disturbances after animal attacks, she explained. These are normal responses to an abnormal situation. If you notice these symptoms persisting, please reach out for support. By evening, exhaustion finally overcame Rachel's racing thoughts, and she fell into a fitful sleep interrupted by vivid dreams. In one, she was running through an endless forest, the sound of heavy breathing and cracking twigs always just behind her. In another, she was frozen in place as a massive bear approached, its eyes reflecting an unnatural intelligence. She woke with a start at 2:17 a.m., according to the digital clock on the wall, her heart pounding. The hospital room was dimly lit by the monitors beside her bed, casting strange shadows across the unfamiliar space. For a disorienting moment, Rachel thought she was still in the forest until the steady beep of the heart rate monitor anchored her back to reality. A night nurse appeared, likely alerted by the spike in her heart rate. "Bad dream?" she asked sympathetically, checking Rachel's IV lines and adjusting her blankets. "That's common after trauma. Would you like something to help you sleep?" Rachel hesitated, then nodded. The nurse administered a mild sedative through her IV, and within minutes she drifted back to sleep, this time deeper and without dreams. Morning brought Dr. Fletcher for rounds, accompanied by a younger doctor she introduced as Dr. Patel, the infectious disease specialist. They removed Rachel's bandages to examine the wounds, their expressions concerning to Rachel. "The infection is progressing despite the antibiotics," Dr. Fletcher explained, pointing to the angry red streaks extending from the puncture wounds up Rachel's calf. "This isn't uncommon with animal bites, particularly those from wild animals. Dr. Patel is going to adjust your antibiotic regimen. We're switching you to a combination therapy targeting the specific bacteria commonly found in bear saliva," Dr. Patel added, making notes in her chart. "We've also sent cultures to the lab to identify exactly what we're dealing with, but those results won't be back for a few days." Rachel listened to their clinical discussion with a strange detachment, as though they were talking about someone else's leg. The reality of her situation, that she was hospitalized with a potentially serious infection from a bear bite, still hadn't fully registered. "When can I go back to school?" she asked, thinking of her research deadline. "I have a thesis to complete." The doctors exchanged glances. "At minimum, you'll need to remain hospitalized until the infection is controlled," Dr. Fletcher said carefully. "That's likely to be several days. After that, you'll need follow-up care and possibly physical therapy, depending on how the wounds heal. I would estimate at least 2 weeks before you can return to regular activities, and even then you'll need to avoid putting weight on that ankle." The timeline hit Rachel harder than she'd expected. 2 weeks would push dangerously close to her thesis deadline, and field research was now clearly out of the question. Years of work culminating in her graduate thesis, and a bear had jeopardized it all in seconds. After the doctors left, Rachel reached for her phone and sent an email to Dr. Wilson, explaining the medical prognosis and the impact on her research. Timeline. His reply came within minutes. "Focus on healing. We'll request an extension based on medical necessity. Your health comes first." The response should have been reassuring, but Rachel found herself fighting tears of frustration. The attack had derailed not just her immediate research plans, but potentially her entire academic trajectory. A delayed thesis could mean delayed graduation, which could affect job applications and future research opportunities. Her dark thoughts were interrupted by another visitor, Sheriff Tom Lawson from the Piscataquis County Sheriff's Department. A broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and salt and pepper hair, he introduced himself with a firm handshake. "Miss Nguyen, I hope you're feeling better today. I'm here to take your statement about the bear attack. Wildlife incidents involving injuries fall under our jurisdiction for official documentation." For what felt like the dozenth time, Rachel recounted the details of the attack. Sheriff Lawson took meticulous notes, occasionally asking for clarification, but otherwise listening attentively. "Any idea what might have attracted the bear to you specifically?" he asked when she had finished. "Were you carrying food or scented items?" Rachel considered the question. "I had some granola bars and trail mix in my backpack, but they were in sealed containers. I'm trained in proper food storage for bear country. I think it was more likely curiosity than food attraction. I was sitting very still, recording bird calls, probably not registering as a threat." The sheriff nodded. "That fits with what we know about black bear behavior. They're naturally curious but usually avoid humans when detected early. Being quiet and focused on your work probably meant you didn't notice its approach until it was too close." He closed his notebook. "We'll file this report with the State Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. They track all bear encounters for population management purposes." Before leaving, Sheriff Lawson awkwardly added, "My daughter's studying wildlife biology at UMaine Farmington. She'd probably think what you were doing was pretty cool despite how it turned out." The comment, clearly meant to be supportive, reminded Rachel of the passion that had driven her into the field in the first place, a passion now complicated by first-hand experience of the dangers that came with wilderness research. Throughout the day, hospital staff came and went, nurses checking her vital signs and changing IV bags, an orderly delivering meals she barely touched, a physical therapist discussing future rehabilitation exercises. By evening, Rachel was exhausted from the constant interruptions, yet restless from being confined to bed. Dr. Fletcher returned for evening rounds, examining the wounds, again with a slightly more optimistic expression. The new antibiotics seem to be helping. The spreading infection has slowed, though we're not out of the woods yet. She paused, realizing her unfortunate choice of words. Pardon the expression. Rachel managed a weak smile at the unintentional pun. When do you think I can be discharged? I need to get back to my research if possible. The doctor's expression grew serious. Rachel, I understand your academic work is important, but right now your health has to be the priority. Bear bites can lead to serious complications if not properly treated. We're looking at a minimum of 3 more days of IV antibiotics, possibly longer depending on how your body responds. The news settled heavily on Rachel's already burdened spirits. 3 more days in hospital, followed by weeks of recovery. The timeline for her thesis now seemed impossible, and beyond the practical concerns lay a deeper, more unsettling realization. Her relationship with the natural world, once characterized by curiosity and appreciation, had fundamentally changed. That night, despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded Rachel. When she did drift off, the nightmares returned, more vivid than before. In one particularly disturbing dream, she was setting up her recording equipment in a familiar clearing, but the bird calls coming through her headphones gradually transformed into the growls and huffs of an approaching predator. She woke gasping, the hospital room momentarily unfamiliar in the pre-dawn dimness. Outside her window, the first hints of sunrise colored the sky, illuminating the distant tree line. The forest that had drawn her for research now seemed ominous, a boundary between safety and danger. The day passed slowly, marked by medical procedures, brief visits from hospital staff, and long stretches of solitude. Rachel tried to distract herself by reviewing research notes on her laptop, which a helpful nurse had retrieved from her belongings, but found her concentration repeatedly broken by flashbacks to the attack. In the afternoon, her phone rang, an unknown local number. "Rachel Nguyen?" a male voice asked when she answered. "Yes, who's this?" "Jason Whitaker, Bangor Daily News. I understand you were attacked by a bear in Baxter State Park yesterday. I'd like to get your account of what happened for a story we're running." Rachel hesitated, caught off guard by the media interest. "How did you get my number?" "Public University Directory," the reporter replied smoothly. "Your story is important. Bear attacks are rare in Maine, and people need to know about potential dangers in our parks. Would you be willing to talk about your experience?" A mixture of emotions washed over Rachel. Discomfort at the idea of publicizing her trauma, concern about how the incident might be portrayed, uncertainty about the implications for bear management in the park. "I don't think I want to make a statement right now," she said finally. "I'm still recovering, and there's an official investigation underway." The reporter pressed again, but Rachel remained firm in her refusal. After ending the call, she found herself unexpectedly shaken. The idea that her experience was now potentially newsworthy added another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. Later that evening, Ranger Martinez returned, this time with news. "We've identified the bear from trail camera footage," she reported, showing Rachel photos on her tablet. "Male black bear, approximately 3 years old based on size. We've seen him in the area before. He's tagged from a population study last year." Rachel studied the images. Clear shots of a black bear moving through the forest, a small yellow tag visible on its ear. It looked smaller in the photos than it had seemed during the attack, more like an overgrown dog than the monster of her nightmares. "What will happen to him?" she asked again. Her feelings toward the animal still conflicted. Fear mingled with the researcher's instinctive interest. "We're monitoring his movements, but so far, he's showing normal, non-aggressive behavior," the ranger explained. "Based on your account and our assessment, This seems to have been a defensive reaction after being startled, not predatory behavior. The current plan is to maintain warnings in the area, but not to remove the bear unless there are further incidents. Rachel found herself relieved by this news, despite everything. As a wildlife researcher, she understood the ecological importance of large predators, even while now personally experiencing the danger they could pose. There's something else. Ranger Martinez continued, her tone shifting. A reporter contacted our office asking about your case. I declined to provide details beyond confirming that an incident occurred, but I wanted you to know there's media interest. These stories tend to get attention. Rachel told the ranger about the earlier call from the newspaper. I didn't say anything. That feels exploitative somehow. Martinez nodded understandingly. You're under no obligation to speak to the media. If you'd prefer, the Park Service can issue a standard statement that protects your privacy while providing the public with necessary safety information. The offer was a relief, one less thing for Rachel to manage. I'd appreciate that, thank you. The ranger stayed a while longer, helping Rachel complete an official incident report for the Park Service records. The document was surprisingly detailed, requiring information about weather conditions, time of day, specific location, and Rachel's actions before, during, and after the encounter. These reports help us improve safety protocols and educational materials, Martinez explained, as Rachel signed the completed form. Your experience, while unfortunate for you personally, provides valuable data that might prevent similar incidents in the future. The idea that her traumatic experience might help others was some consolation, though small compared to the physical and emotional impact of the attack itself. On her third day in the hospital, the medical news finally improved. Dr. Fletcher arrived for morning rounds looking pleased. The infection is responding to treatment, she announced after examining Rachel's ankle. The swelling has decreased and the redness is less extensive. If this continues, we can consider switching you to oral antibiotics tomorrow and discussing discharge planning. The prospect of leaving the hospital lifted Rachel's spirits considerably. Though she was under no illusions about the lengthy recovery still ahead, the idea of returning to familiar surroundings, her apartment, the university campus, represented a step toward normalcy. That afternoon, Dr. Wilson came to visit, bringing a care package from the graduate students in Rachel's department. Books, snacks, a stuffed black bear with a bandaged paw, someone's idea of gallows humor that actually made Rachel smile, and a card signed by faculty and students alike. Everyone's pulling for you, her advisor said, settling into the visitor's chair. And I've spoken with the department chair and graduate committee. They've approved an extension for your thesis submission, 3 months beyond the original deadline, with the possibility of further accommodation if needed. The news removed a significant weight from Rachel's shoulders. Thank you. I was worried about falling behind. Dr. Wilson waved away her concern. Your health comes first. Besides, this experience gives you a unique perspective on human-wildlife interactions that might actually enhance your research. Rachel considered this suggestion, turning it over in her mind. Her thesis focused on urban wildlife adaptations, particularly bird communication patterns in human-dominated landscapes. Could her bear encounter somehow connect to this work? The idea seemed far-fetched, yet there was something there, a thread about humans and wildlife navigating shared spaces, about the boundaries between the wild and the civilized. They discussed possible adjustments to her research approach, ways to incorporate data she'd already collected, while minimizing the need for additional fieldwork during her recovery. Dr. Wilson's practical support and academic perspective helped ground Rachel, reminding her of the larger context of her work beyond this single frightening incident. After he left, Rachel opened her laptop and for the first time since the attack, felt genuinely engaged with her research again. She began making notes about potential thesis revisions, considering how her experience might inform a new section on risk assessment in wildlife research. The next morning brought the news Rachel had been hoping for. Her lab results showed the infection was under control, and Dr. Fletcher approved her discharge with a regimen of oral antibiotics and strict wound care instructions. You'll need to see your primary care physician in Orono within 3 days, the doctor instructed, as she completed the discharge paperwork. And you'll require follow-up with an orthopedic specialist to monitor healing and assess any potential long-term mobility issues. No weight-bearing on that ankle for at least 2 weeks. You'll need to use crutches. A physical therapist arrived, with the promised crutches and spent an hour teaching Rachel how to navigate various surfaces, level floors, inclines, stairs, with her injured leg elevated. The exercise was exhausting but necessary, and by the end of the session, Rachel felt reasonably confident in her ability to manage her basic mobility needs. The final visitor before discharge was a hospital administrator with insurance, paperwork and information about follow-up care. "Your university insurance should cover most of these expenses," she explained, "but there may be some out-of-pocket costs for specialized equipment or certain medications. Here's information about applying for assistance from the state's Victims of Wildlife Injury Compensation Fund if needed." Rachel hadn't even known such a fund existed, a sobering reminder of how many others had experienced similar encounters with Maine's wildlife. The paperwork made the experience bureaucratically official in a way that somehow drove home its reality more than the physical pain had done. By early afternoon, Rachel was officially discharged, wheeled to the hospital entrance, where a university-arranged transport service waited to drive her back to Orono. The journey of nearly 2 hours passed largely in silence, Rachel watching the Maine landscape roll by, dense forests interspersed with small towns and occasional glimpses of lakes or rivers. Somewhere in those woods, the bear that had attacked her continued its life, perhaps even now foraging for food, unaware of the profound impact it had had on her life. Arriving at her apartment building in Orono presented the first real challenge of her recovery. The second-floor walk-up that had never before seemed inconvenient now loomed as a formidable obstacle. The transport driver, a kind middle-aged man named Frank, insisted on helping her navigate the stairs and carrying her small bag of belongings. "My daughter broke her leg skiing last winter," he explained as he patiently matched his pace to Rachel's, cautious progress up the stairs. "I remember how tough those first few days were. Don't be too proud to ask for help." Inside her apartment, Rachel was struck by how unchanged everything was. Books stacked on the coffee table, unwashed coffee, mug in the sink, field jacket hung by the door, while she herself felt fundamentally altered. The familiar space seemed to belong to a different Rachel, one whose biggest concern had been thesis deadlines and grant applications, not bear attacks and wound infections. Frank helped her settle in, bringing her a glass of water and making sure she had everything within reach before departing with well wishes for her recovery. Left alone, Rachel awkwardly maneuvered to her couch and elevated her leg as instructed, suddenly overwhelmed by the silence and solitude. She reached for her phone and saw several text messages from friends who had heard about the attack. Expressions of concern, offers of help, questions about what happened. The task of responding to each seemed monumental in her exhausted state. Instead, she composed a single group message: "Home from hospital. On the mend but tired. Will share details when I'm up to it. Could use company, help with meals in coming days if anyone's free." The responses came quickly. Friends organizing a meal delivery schedule, offers to run errands or provide transportation to medical appointments, plans for visits staggered throughout the week to avoid overwhelming her. The outpouring of support brought unexpected tears to Rachel's eyes. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, focused on survival and then on medical treatment, she hadn't processed the emotional impact of the experience. That evening, as she struggled through the awkward process of showering while keeping her bandaged ankle dry, Rachel caught sight of her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The person staring back looked different somehow. Thinner, paler, with shadows beneath her eyes that hadn't been there before. But there was something else too, a certain hardness around the eyes, a watchfulness that spoke of newfound wariness. She thought of Ranger Martinez's words about the psychological impacts of wildlife attacks. At the time, focused on her physical injuries, Rachel had largely dismissed the concern. Now, alone in her apartment, jumping at small noises and hesitant to glance out windows facing the wooded area behind her building, she recognized the truth in the ranger's warning. Sleep that. Night was fitful, interrupted by now familiar nightmares of pursuit and attack. Rachel woke shortly after dawn, groggy and unrested, her ankle throbbing despite the pain medication. As she waited for the pills to take effect, she opened her laptop and almost without conscious decision began typing. The Bear Encounter. Reflections on Wilderness Research and Risk. The words flowed more easily than she'd expected, not an academic analysis, but a personal narrative of her experience. The attack itself, the medical treatment, and most significantly, the shifting perspective on her relationship with the natural world. Writing became therapeutic, a way of processing what had happened and beginning to integrate it into her understanding of herself and her work. Around mid-morning, a knock at her door announced the arrival of her first visitor, Mei Zhang, a fellow graduate student from the ecology department. Mei arrived bearing groceries, homemade soup, and a stack of academic journals. "I figured you might be going stir-crazy without your research materials," she explained, unpacking the food into Rachel's refrigerator. "And I brought the latest issue of the Journal of Wildlife Management. There's an article on non-invasive research methods you might find interesting." Rachel was grateful not just for the practical help, but for Mei's matter-of-fact approach. Rather than treating her as fragile or dwelling on the attack, Mei chatted about department gossip, recent research developments, and their shared frustrations with the university administration's latest policies. "Dr. Wilson mentioned you got an extension on your thesis," Mei said as she prepared tea in Rachel's small kitchen. "Have you thought about how you'll adjust your research questions?" The normalcy of the academic discussion was grounding. For an hour, Rachel was simply a graduate student discussing research methodology, not a bear attack victim or hospital patient. It offered a glimpse of the life that awaited beyond recovery, a reminder that this experience, while significant, was not the entirety of her identity. After Mei left, promising to return in a few days, Rachel returned to her writing, adding, "Reflections on this interaction, the importance of maintaining professional identity through trauma, the way academic work could provide structure and purpose during recovery." The next few days established a new routine. Mornings were devoted to medical care, changing bandages, exercises prescribed by the physical therapist, medication management. Late mornings and afternoons were for academic work, reading, note-taking, and gradually revising her thesis proposal to accommodate her new limitations. Evenings brought visitors, friends bringing meals, fellow researchers discussing projects, occasionally family members checking in via video calls. On the fourth day after her discharge, Rachel received an unexpected email from the editor of the Journal of Human-Wildlife Conflicts, a respected academic publication in her field. The subject line, "Interest in your bear encounter experience," caused her to hesitate before opening it. "Dear Ms. Nguyen," the message read, "word has reached our editorial board about your recent bear encounter while conducting field research in Baxter State Park. While we regret your injury and the interruption to your work, we believe your experience could provide valuable insights for other field researchers. We would be interested in considering a first-person account or analysis of the incident for publication in our upcoming special issue on researcher safety. Please contact me if this might be of interest." Rachel stared at the screen, conflicted. The invitation represented professional recognition, a publication opportunity in a respected journal that would look impressive on her CV. Yet it also meant further dwelling on an experience she was still working to process and potentially opening herself to broader public attention. She forwarded the email to Dr. Wilson, seeking his advice. His response came within the hour. "Interesting opportunity. Could be therapeutic to reshape the experience professionally. Also establishes you as someone with unique practical knowledge in the field, but only if you feel ready. No pressure either way." Rachel's daily check-in call with her parents that evening included discussion of the journal invitation. Her mother, a community college English professor, was enthusiastic. "Writing about trauma can be healing, honey, and your experience might help keep other researchers safe." Her father, more practically minded, asked about compensation and time commitment. "Just make sure it doesn't interfere with your thesis work or recovery. That should remain the priority." After the call, Rachel returned to the personal narrative she'd been writing, now nearly 20 pages of reflections, memories, and analyses of her experience. Reading through it, she recognized that she'd already been doing the work of processing the attack through writing. Perhaps shaping some of this material into a formal article would indeed be beneficial, both professionally and personally. The next day brought her first venture outside since returning home, a follow-up appointment with a local orthopedic specialist, Dr. Abrams. A friend from her department, Kevin, drove her to the clinic, waiting patiently as the doctor examined her ankle, took x-rays, and reviewed her treatment plan. "The puncture wounds are healing well," Dr. Abrams reported, studying the x-ray images displayed on his computer screen. "No signs of bone damage or joint involvement, which is fortunate. You'll likely have some scarring, but with proper physical therapy, I expect you'll regain full functionality. The positive prognosis was encouraging, though Dr. Abrams was careful to set realistic expectations about the recovery timeline. We're looking at another week of non-weight bearing, then gradual introduction of partial weight bearing with supportive devices. Full recovery typically takes 6 to 8 weeks for injuries of this nature. On the drive back to her apartment, Kevin mentioned seeing a small news article about the attack. It was just a brief piece in the local section of the Bangor paper, he assured her, noting her immediate tension. Didn't mention you by name, just said a university researcher had been injured in a bear encounter at Baxter. The focus was mostly on the Park Service's response and safety recommendations for hikers. Though the article seemed innocuous enough, its existence bothered Rachel. Her experience, deeply personal and still raw, had become a matter of public record, however anonymized. It reinforced her sense that the attack had dimensions beyond her individual trauma, public safety implications, policy considerations, educational opportunities. That evening, she drafted a response to the journal editor, expressing tentative interest in contributing an article about her experience, with a focus on safety protocols for field researchers and lessons learned. The act of reframing her trauma as professional insight felt empowering, a way of reclaiming control over the narrative. A week after returning home, Rachel received a package from the Park Service containing her salvaged research equipment. Most items had been recovered, though her primary parabolic microphone, the most expensive piece, had been damaged beyond repair. Accompanying the equipment was a note from Ranger Martinez with an update on the bear monitoring situation. No further concerning behaviors had been observed, and the animal continued to maintain a healthy distance from human-occupied areas of the park. Examining her recovered field notebook, Rachel found it stained with dirt and what might have been her own blood, the pages wavy from exposure to morning dew. The last entry broke off mid-sentence. White-throated sparrow vocalizing at northeast edge of clearing, possibly responding to the moment before the bear had appeared. She ran her fingers over the abrupt ending, a tangible record of the interruption the attack had represented in her life and work. Rather than returning the notebook to her shelf, Rachel decided to continue using it, deliberately turning to a fresh page and beginning a new entry. Field research resumed in modified form. Campus locations only, with emphasis on urban bird adaptations. Weather clear, 62 degrees, light northeast wind. The continuity felt important, a statement that her scientific work proceeded despite the attack. As physical recovery progressed, Rachel gradually expanded her activities. Short walks around her, blocked with crutches, became trips to campus, first for brief meetings with her advisor, then for longer sessions in the research library. She began collecting new bird vocalization data from the university's wooded areas, always in open spaces, always with a research partner, always with heightened awareness of her surroundings. The University Counseling Center provided 6 free sessions with a therapist specializing in trauma recovery. Initially reluctant, Rachel found the professional support unexpectedly helpful, particularly in addressing the persistent nightmares and anxiety that continued to disrupt her sleep and concentration. What you're experiencing is a normal response to an abnormal event, the therapist Dr. Meredith Chen assured her during their first session. The hypervigilance, the nightmares, the intrusive memories, these are your brain's attempts to process what happened and prevent similar dangers in the future. Through these sessions, Rachel began developing coping strategies for the psychological aftermath of the attack. Grounding techniques helped manage flashbacks, while cognitive restructuring addressed irrational fears that had begun to extend beyond bears to other aspects of the natural world. I used to find the sound of rustling leaves soothing, Rachel admitted during one session. Now it instantly triggers panic. Part of me knows that's irrational. There are no bears in my apartment complex, but the response is automatic. The gradual reclamation of her relationship with nature became as important to Rachel's recovery as the physical healing of her ankle. Small steps, sitting on a park bench, walking paved nature trails with friends, identifying bird calls from a safe distance, helped rebuild confidence that had been shattered by the attack. 3 weeks after the incident, Rachel submitted a draft article to the Journal of Human-Wildlife Conflicts titled "When Research Subjects Bite Back, safety protocols and psychological preparedness for wildlife field researchers, the piece combined personal narrative with practical recommendations and theoretical framework for understanding human-wildlife conflict in research settings. The editor's response was enthusiastic, requesting only minor revisions before accepting the article for publication in the upcoming special issue. This professional validation of her experience provided another kind of healing, transforming the attack from merely a personal trauma to a contribution to her field. Around the same time, Rachel began serious revisions to her thesis project, incorporating elements of her new perspective while maintaining the core research questions about urban bird adaptations. While fieldwork in remote locations was no longer feasible given her physical limitations and psychological readiness, she developed alternative methodologies using existing data and accessible urban and campus sites. Dr. Wilson approved the revised proposal, noting that the adjustments demonstrated commendable adaptability and resourcefulness in challenging circumstances, skills, he pointed out, that were as valuable in a research career as technical knowledge or field experience. As the 6-week mark of her recovery approached, Rachel received another communication related to the attack, an official letter from the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. The agency had reviewed her case as part of their wildlife management assessment and were updating her on their decisions regarding the bear involved in the incident. Based on comprehensive evaluation, including review of the animal's behavior patterns before and after the encounter, the department has classified this as a defensive attack triggered by surprise encounter, the letter stated. The bear in question, tag Euro M347, has shown no subsequent aggressive behaviors and maintains appropriate avoidance of human-occupied areas. Therefore, no management action regarding this specific animal is deemed necessary at this time. The letter continued with information about the department's ongoing bear management strategies, public education efforts, and research initiatives aimed at minimizing human-wildlife conflicts. It concluded by thanking Rachel for her detailed reporting of the incident, which had contributed valuable data to our understanding of black bear behavior in recreational wilderness areas. Reading the official documentation of the decision to leave the bear unpunished for what was, from a human perspective, an attack, and from the bear's perspective, a defensive response to a perceived threat, Rachel felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that the animal would not be destroyed because of her encounter, scientific appreciation for the ecological approach to wildlife management, and a lingering, irrational sense of injustice that the creature that had caused her so much pain and disruption would continue its life unchanged, while she still struggled with the aftermath. She shared these conflicted feelings in her next therapy session with Dr. Chen. "I know it's the right decision ecologically," she explained, "and as a wildlife researcher, I support it, but there's this emotional part of me that wants, I don't know, some acknowledgement from the universe that what happened to me matters." "That's a very human response," Dr. Chen observed. "We seek narrative closure, consequences that match impacts, recognition of our suffering. Nature operates by different rules, are moral, focused on survival and adaptation rather than justice or meaning. Part of your recovery involves reconciling your human need for significance with the indifferent natural world in which this occurred." The insight resonated with Rachel, helping her understand the disconnect between her intellectual acceptance of the wildlife management decision and her emotional response to it. It also suggested a new dimension for her thesis work, exploring how human psychological frameworks for understanding the natural world influence conservation attitudes and policy decisions. 8 weeks after the attack, Rachel attended her final scheduled physical therapy session. Her recovery had progressed well, with nearly full range of motion restored to her ankle and only occasional pain during extended physical activity. The physical therapist, a cheerful woman named Diane, who had worked with her throughout the recovery process, conducted a final assessment. "You've made excellent progress," she concluded, reviewing the measurements and notes in Rachel's file. "I'm officially graduating you from PT, though I'd recommend continuing the strengthening exercises on your own. And don't hesitate to come back if you notice any regression or new issues." "Will I have any permanent limitations?" Rachel asked, the question she'd been hesitant to pose earlier in her recovery. Diane considered thoughtfully. "The scarring is permanent, of course," she said, indicating the still visible marks where the bear's teeth had punctured Rachel's ankle. "And you might notice some weather sensitivity, discomfort when storms are approaching, that sort of thing. Heavy hiking with a full pack might cause more fatigue in that ankle than before, but for normal daily activities and moderate exercise, you should have full functionality." The prognosis was better than Rachel had initially feared during those first painful days in the hospital. The physical reminders of the attack would remain, 4 distinct scars marking her ankle, but they would not significantly limit her future activities or career options. As her physical recovery neared completion, Rachel found herself increasingly focused on the psychological aspects of her experience. The nightmares had decreased in frequency, but still occurred occasionally. Certain triggers, the sound of breaking branches, unexpected movements in her peripheral vision, documentary footage of bears, could still provoke momentary panic responses. And her relationship with wilderness settings remained complicated, characterized by a wariness that had replaced her former comfortable familiarity. Rachel's revised thesis work proceeded steadily, with her new focus on urban wildlife adaptations proving scientifically valuable despite the circumstances that had prompted the change. Her advisor noted that her writing had gained depth and nuance since the attack, reflecting a more complex understanding of human-wildlife interactions and the psychological dimensions of nature conservation. The article for the Journal of Human Wildlife Conflicts was published in the October issue. Receiving positive responses from colleagues in the field, several researchers contacted Rachel to share similar experiences or to discuss her safety recommendations for field researchers. What had begun as a traumatic interruption to her academic work had, unexpectedly, established her as having a unique perspective within her discipline. 3 months after the attack, Rachel received an invitation that would test her recovery progress in a new way. Dr. Wilson forwarded an email from the organizers of an upcoming conference on human-wildlife coexistence, requesting that Rachel present her recently published paper as part of a panel on researcher safety in the field. "This would be an excellent professional opportunity," Dr. Wilson noted in his accompanying message, "but only if you feel ready. The conference is in Burlington, Vermont, close enough to drive, but far enough to feel like a professional trip. Think about it, and let me know what you decide." The invitation precipitated a period of intense self-assessment for Rachel. Professionally, the opportunity was significant. Presenting at a respected conference would enhance her academic profile and create networking opportunities. Personally, it represented a challenge to the boundaries she had established during her recovery. After careful consideration and discussion with her therapist, Rachel accepted the invitation with certain conditions. She would require a co-presenter in case the emotional impact became overwhelming, and she would have discretion over which aspects of her experience to share publicly. Preparing for the conference presentation became Rachel's focus over the following weeks. She worked closely with Kevin, who had agreed to serve as her co-presenter, developing a presentation that balanced personal narrative with scientific analysis and practical recommendations. The process itself became another form of therapeutic processing, transforming her individual trauma into educational content for her professional community. The conference, held at the University of Vermont, marked Rachel's first significant professional engagement since the attack, as well as her first overnight trip. The travel itself proved more challenging than anticipated. Each mile that took her further from familiar surroundings triggered subtle anxiety, a heightened awareness of vulnerability that she had not experienced before the attack. Her presentation, scheduled for the second day of the conference, drew a larger audience than expected. As Rachel approached the podium, she felt a momentary surge of panic, not from public speaking itself, which had never particularly troubled her, but from the prospect of revisiting the attack in such a public forum. Taking a deep breath, she began with the academic framework, statistics on wildlife encounters during field research, existing safety protocols, gaps in researcher preparation. Only then did she transition to her personal experience, presenting it with professional detachment despite the emotional weight behind her words. At 8:17 a.m. on that September morning, I experienced firsthand the consequences of a knowledge gap in my field preparation, she told the attentive audience. While my scientific training had equipped me to identify dozens of bird species by their calls alone, It had not adequately prepared me for the specific sounds of an approaching black bear, nor for the psychological impact that would follow such an encounter. The presentation concluded with Rachel and Kevin's joint recommendations for enhanced safety training, psychological preparedness, and post-incident support for field researchers. The question session that followed was thoughtful and collegial, focusing primarily on the practical and institutional implications rather than the sensational aspects of the attack itself. Afterward, several senior researchers approached Rachel, sharing their own close calls in the field and expressing appreciation for her willingness to transform a traumatic experience into educational content for the community. One professor from Cornell mentioned incorporating her safety recommendations into his department's field research training. That evening, at a reception for conference presenters, Rachel found herself engaged in conversation with Dr. Eleanor Abernathy, a prominent researcher in human-wildlife conflict, whose work Rachel had cited extensively in her graduate studies. "Your presentation today was important," Dr. Abernathy told her as they found a quiet corner away from the main crowd. "We don't talk enough about the psychological dimensions of fieldwork in wildlife disciplines. There's this unspoken expectation of toughness, as though acknowledging fear or trauma somehow undermines scientific credibility." Rachel nodded, recognizing the truth in this observation. "I've been thinking about that a lot during my recovery, how we prepare researchers technically, but not emotionally for field experiences. Which is why accounts like yours matter," Dr. Abernathy continued. "They help normalize the full range of human responses to wildlife encounters." She paused, studying Rachel thoughtfully. "Have you considered expanding your article into something more comprehensive? Perhaps a training module for field researchers or a chapter in a methodology text?" The suggestion opened a new possibility Rachel hadn't previously considered, transforming her experience into formal educational material that might help prepare other researchers for the realities of fieldwork. She promised Dr. Abernathy she would give it serious thought. Returning to Maine after the conference, Rachel felt a subtle shift in her relationship with the attack. Presenting it professionally, receiving validation from established researchers, and considering its educational potential had begun transforming it from a purely personal trauma to a professionally relevant experience, still difficult, still impactful, but increasingly integrated into her academic identity rather than standing apart from it. The final weeks of the fall semester saw Rachel completing her revised thesis, incorporating insights from both her original research and the new perspectives gained through her bear encounter experience. The document, titled Urban Adaptations and Human-Wildlife Boundaries, Communication Patterns Across Species and Spaces, represented not just the culmination of her graduate work, but a testament to her resilience and adaptability. Dr. Wilson's feedback on the completed draft was effusive. "This work demonstrates extraordinary scholarly growth," he wrote in his assessment. "You've transformed what could have been merely a personal setback into a catalyst for deeper theoretical engagement with your subject matter. The integration of psychological perspectives on human-wildlife boundaries adds a dimension to this research that sets it apart from typical work in the field." As the anniversary of the attack approached, Rachel found herself reflecting on the year's journey. Physically, her recovery was essentially complete. The scars on her ankle had faded from angry red to silvery white, and she had regained full functionality with only occasional discomfort during changes in weather. Professionally, what had initially seemed like a devastating interruption had ultimately enhanced her academic profile through the journal publication, conference presentation, and strengthened thesis. Psychologically, the recovery remained ongoing. The nightmares had become rare, occurring now only during periods of stress or exhaustion. She had gradually expanded her comfort zone in natural settings, regularly walking campus nature trails, and occasionally venturing into more secluded woodland areas, though always with companions and with a heightened awareness of her surroundings that she suspected would never fully dissipate. The most significant lasting change was in her relationship with wilderness itself. The uncomplicated appreciation she had once felt had been replaced by a more complex understanding, respect tinged with wariness, scientific interest balanced with personal caution. She had not returned to Baxter State Park, nor did she have immediate plans to do so, but she no longer ruled out the possibility of someday resuming more remote fieldwork. On the exact anniversary of the attack, Rachel made a deliberate choice to spend the day engaged in positive association with nature. She organized a small group of friends and colleagues for a bird-watching excursion to a well-maintained local nature preserve, bringing along her recording equipment, new replacements for the items damaged during the attack, to capture comparative data for her ongoing research. As they walked the trails, Rachel found herself more attuned than ever to the sounds around her. Not just the bird calls she had always studied, but the fuller acoustic environment of the forest, including the subtle indicators of larger animal movements that she had once missed. Her experience had sharpened certain perceptual abilities, even as it had complicated her emotional responses. At one point, the group paused at a lookout point overlooking a small pond. While the others chatted quietly, Rachel stood slightly apart, listening through her headphones to the amplified natural soundscape. A familiar call caught her attention, a white-throated sparrow, the same species she had been recording when the bear approached a year ago. For a moment, the sound triggered a flash of remembered fear, the sensory echo of that morning in Baxter, but the response passed quickly, replaced by professional interest in the acoustic patterns. She noted the frequency and cadence in her field journal, the same notebook that still contained the abruptly ended entry from the attack day, now filled with a year's worth of subsequent observations. That evening, alone in her apartment, Rachel opened her laptop and began writing again, not an academic paper this time, but a personal reflection on the year since the attack. As she typed, she glanced occasionally at her ankle, at the scars that would remain with her always, physical reminders of an encounter that had lasted only minutes but had altered the course of her life and work in ways still unfolding. Outside, her window, the September sunset painted the sky in deepening shades of orange and purple. Somewhere in the distant Maine wilderness, the bear that had attacked her, tag Bodym 347 in the Wildlife Department's records, might be preparing for another winter, unaware of its role in her story. Their paths had crossed just once momentarily, yet the ripples from that brief intersection continued to shape Rachel's understanding of herself, her research, and the complex relationship between humans and the wild spaces they study, but never fully comprehend. In her final therapy session, Rachel had discussed this strange connection with Dr. Chen. "There's something almost mythic about it," she had said. "This animal that changed my life doesn't know I exist, at least not beyond that one moment of mutual fear. It just continues being a bear, following its nature, while I'm still here, making meaning from our encounter." "Perhaps that's the most profound insight from your experience," Dr. Chen had suggested. "The recognition that meaning-making is a uniquely human endeavor. Nature simply is, neither malevolent nor benevolent, just present and real and following its own imperatives." As Rachel completed her anniversary reflection, she returned to this thought, ending with words that encompassed both her scientific understanding and her personal journey. "1 year after a black bear's teeth marked my body, I carry both visible scars and invisible recalibrations, a heightened awareness of vulnerability, a more nuanced appreciation of wilderness, a deeper understanding of the arbitrary nature of life-changing moments. The bear has continued its bare existence, concerned only with survival and instinctive imperatives, while I have spent months analyzing, processing, and integrating our brief encounter into my human narrative. Perhaps this, ultimately, is the most accurate definition of the human-wildlife boundary, not geographic delineations or management policies, but the fundamental difference in how we experience and process the same shared world. The bear knows nothing of my thesis or my nightmares or my professional presentations about our encounter. I can never fully know its experience of that morning beyond observable behaviors. We inhabit the same physical planet, but entirely different, perceptual universes, crossing paths occasionally in moments that mean everything to one species and almost nothing to the other. This asymmetry of meaning lies at the heart of both our fascination with wildlife and our eternal separation from it, a reality that no amount of scientific study can fully bridge, but which we must continue to explore and respect if we are to coexist on this shared earth.